Chapter 574. Barry Diller's tone was very calm, but Eric realized that there would be no result if they continued to talk about this topic. Although Eric felt a little regretful, it was more of a pity. With Barry Diller's talent, running QVC, a TV shopping company with less than $1 billion, would definitely not be able to fully utilize his talents. Moreover, Eric knew very well that in a few years, with the emergence of e-commerce, TV shopping would soon be abandoned. Barry Diller had given up this opportunity, so there was little hope for him to return to Hollywood. Since his goal was not achieved, Eric was not in a hurry to leave. The two casually chatted about other things. It was not until 3 o'clock in the afternoon that Eric's mobile phone rang. After the call was connected, Eric listened to the person on the other end of the phone and quickly hung up the phone. Eric did not avoid Barry Diller when he answered the phone. Therefore, after he hung up the phone, Barry Diller said, "Was that Jeffrey?" Eric nodded with a smile. Barry Diller had received a lot of attention during this period. Although the dust of the acquisition of Paramount had settled, the attention on Barry Diller did not immediately disappear. In just a few hours after the two met, the news had spread to many people. Although both parties knew that Jeffrey Katzenberg must have called to test Eric's intention to contact Barry Diller, Eric still explained. Jeffrey said that one of the company's movies had just finished the final cut and asked if I wanted to watch the finished film. "Then you can go to Burbank. The remaining time is just enough to watch a movie," Barry Diller said with a smile. Then he added, "Jeffrey's character is still a little impatient, similar to Michael. Frank Wales, who is very calm, can complement him in this aspect. You have to know that when Michael was in charge of Disney, Frank had always been the buffer between Michael and the management of Disney. Whenever the management was scolded by Michael, Frank would come forward to appease their emotions. I don't know much about Mr. Hansen, so if Jeffrey is the CEO, I suggest you let Frank continue to be Jeffrey's deputy." Eric got up and put on his coat before reaching out to shake Barry Diller's hand. "Thank you for your suggestion, Barry. I'll consider this matter carefully." Barry Diller personally sent Eric out of the hotel. As soon as the two of them walked out of the hotel, they were surrounded by a group of reporters who had heard the news. They were all asking about the purpose of their meeting. Since Barry Diller didn't accept his invitation, Eric didn't intend to complicate matters. Without saying a word, he got into his car under the protection of his bodyguards. When he arrived at Firefly's headquarters, Eric found that Katzenberg was waiting for him in the hall with a group of people. On the phone, Katzenberg's excuse was to invite Eric over to watch the finished film of Interview with the Vampire. At this time, the director of Interview with the Vampire, Neil Jordan, the original creator, and Rice, Tom Cruise, Kirsten Dunst, and the other main actors were all here. In addition, David Geffen of David Geffen Productions, who had collaborated on the development of the film, was also there. After greeting everyone one by one, although Katzenberg concealed it very well, Eric could still see the doubts and curiosity hidden in his expression. After a simple greeting, the group of people surrounded Eric in the middle and walked to the elevator. Because there were too many people, the group consciously divided into two groups and gave one elevator to Eric, Katzenberg, and David Geffen. After entering the elevator, Eric chatted with David Geffen for a while before asking Katzenberg why he didn't see Michael Lynn and the others. "They're all in Playa Vista," Katzenberg replied, and then said as if nothing had happened, "Eric, why did you suddenly come back today?" Eric explained, "Barry and I are good friends. He failed to snatch Paramount from Lei Sherdong, so I came back in advance to comfort him." Katzenberg nodded and seemed to be relieved. As Barry Diller's old subordinate, Katzenberg had also called to ask after Barry Diller failed to acquire Paramount. However, he didn't believe that Eric had specially returned from New York just for this matter. Compared to himself, Eric's relationship with Barry Diller was much weaker. If he wanted to comfort him, just a phone call would be enough. Katzenberg could also guess the reason for Eric's meeting with Barry Diller. Since Eric said that instead of admitting the purpose of their meeting, it meant that they hadn't reached an agreement on something, and there was no need to continue the discussion. Therefore, he was relieved. "That's right," said Katzenberg. To be honest, Katzenberg didn't think that Michael Eisner was much more capable than him. Many of Disney's successful films in the late 1980s were completed under his leadership. However, compared with Barry Diller, Katzenberg was willing to admit his inferiority. Therefore, Katzenberg found it hard to imagine how the two of them would coexist if Barry Diller joined Firefly Pictures. Katzenberg was definitely unwilling to give up the CEO position of Firefly Pictures, which was about to be in his hands. He had worked hard for so many years to reach the position of the head of a major film company. How could he give it up so easily? However, Katzenberg found it even more unimaginable to let Barry Diller be his subordinate. After putting aside his worries about this matter, Katzenberg became talkative and talked about some recent events. David Geffen, who was also bald and standing on the other side of Eric, also keenly felt that the atmosphere had suddenly become very relaxed, so he echoed. The three of them talked and laughed all the way to the screening room. While the projectionist was preparing to play, Eric leaned over to Katzenberg, who was sitting on his left, and whispered in his ear, "Jeffrey, David seems to be a little too enthusiastic. Did something happen?" David Geffen was sitting on Eric's right. Katzenberg lowered his voice and said, "Geffen Records is about to leave Time Warner." The screening room was not a place to talk. After saying this, Katzenberg sat up straight again. He believed that this sentence was enough for Eric to understand the information he wanted. Eric certainly understood the meaning of Katzenberg's words. It was now 1993. According to the historical development in the original spacetime, David Geffen, Steven Spielberg, and Katzenberg would jointly establish the DreamWorks Film Company next year. However, there was a big deviation in history now. Katzenberg did not leave Disney because of the intensification of his conflict with Michael Eisner, and Spielberg did not have the intention to go solo because of the great success of Jurassic Park. Only David Geffen's record company left Time Warner because of the death of Steve Ross and some conflicts with Time Warner. Although Geffen Records could not be compared with world-class record giants like Columbia Records and Universal Records, David Geffen, who had joined with his own music company when DreamWorks was established in the original spacetime, was the richest of the three. Now that there was no DreamWorks, David Geffen obviously wanted to find a close partner for his record company again. At this time, among the Big Seven, Firefly Pictures was undoubtedly the best choice, except for the old Time Warner that had just left. After the success of Home Alone, Eric also thought for a period of time that he wanted to develop Firefly into a media giant involved in all media and entertainment industries. Of course, a record company was in his plan. However, after a few years of experience and settling down, Eric gradually calmed down. Just as Eric said that he would not be involved in print media when he talked to Elizabeth about Yahoo, Eric found that expanding Firefly's territory into the music field was not a good choice. Like the rapid decline of print media after the new millennium, the record industry had already experienced a decline due to the emergence of tapes that were much cheaper than vinyl records in the 1980s. Under the threat of the piracy industry, after the arrival of the internet era in the next few years, the emergence of online music downloads would completely plunge the record industry into the abyss. Although there were still a few years before the further decline of the record industry, if Firefly wanted to enter the music field with great fanfare, it was possible that under the competition of the traditional record giants, Firefly would use several years of development to establish a firm foothold, and the record industry would be in a harsh winter. That would not be worth the loss. Eric's mood when watching Interview with the Vampire at night might be similar to that of Westerners watching Journey to the West. Without the precipitation of a cultural foundation, it was difficult to have much resonance with this type of film. Throughout the movie, Eric was absent-mindedly thinking about the record company that Katzenberg had just mentioned. After the movie finished playing, Eric somewhat mechanically applauded with the others in the screening room. However, the last thought in his mind was that instead of entering the music distribution field at this time, it was better to use the internet and hardware to build a charging platform like Apple in the original spacetime. That was the way to make money in the music industry in the internet era. The lights in the screening room lit up, and the people in the screening room whispered. Eric was thinking about the idea that had just occurred to him when a female voice sounded in his ear. "Mr. Williams, what do you think of the movie?" Eric looked up and saw Anne Rice, who was about 50 years old and wearing a black suit, with a bob similar to Anna Wintour he met some time ago, approaching him. Eric could see from Anne Rice's expression that she was very satisfied with the movie, but Eric didn't watch the movie carefully just now, so he could only echo according to his memory, "It's great, especially Kirsten's performance. It gave me the feeling that there was a 35-year-old soul hidden in her 12-year-old body." And Rice was a little dissatisfied when she saw Eric sitting there in a daze, but when she heard Eric's words, her mood immediately disappeared, and then she looked as if she had found a confidant. She waved to Kirsten Dunst, who was sitting not far away, and hugged her intimately. She said, "Mr. Williams, what a coincidence. I have the same feeling. How can it not be a coincidence? You said that sentence in the first place." Eric secretly muttered, but on the surface, he said calmly, "So, Ms. Rice, you are also satisfied with this movie, right?" "Yes, I was originally worried that Mr. Cruise wouldn't be able to take on this role, but his performance was far beyond my expectations." "If that's the case, Ms. Rice, why don't you write a review yourself?" Eric followed the woman's tone and said, "This will be very helpful for the promotion of the movie, and also allow more of your fans to see this movie." And Rice's status in the world of vampire novels was almost equivalent to Aunt Cheong Yao's status in the world of romance novels. As long as this famous author expressed her support on the media, the effect would be no less than the effect of millions of dollars of advertising. And Rice did not immediately make a promise, but she said ambiguously, "I will express my true opinion for this movie." After Rice said this, she held Kirsten Dunst's hand and walked out of the theater, whispering something to Loretta from time to time. Everyone quickly moved to a meeting room. A few of the main creators of the movie, the producer of Firefly, the director of the publicity department, and a few specially invited film critics began to express their opinions and make some changes to the details of the movie. Although most of them were looking forward to it, Eric did not express his own opinion. It was still the same sentence. As a guy whose soul came from the West, he did not feel much about vampire movies. If he were to rashly suggest changes, it might be counterproductive. Half an hour into the meeting, David Guffin received a phone call, so he bid farewell to everyone. Eric and Katzenberg also took the opportunity to send David Guffin off and left the meeting room. The parking lot of Firefly Park was open air. When the three of them left the office building and walked towards the parking lot, David Guffin seemed to ask casually, "Mr. Williams, does Firefly Pictures have any intention of developing into the recording industry?" "Sorry, David, I have not considered this aspect. However, Firefly's next phase of focus will be on the television network. Even if we want to enter the recording industry, we will have to wait for a few years." David Guffin responded with an "oh," but his expression did not change much. Although he wanted to rely on Firefly Pictures, it was not that David Guffin did not have any other options. Seeing that Eric was not enthusiastic, he did not say anything else. After David Guffin left, Katzenberg said regretfully, "Eric, actually, I think this is a good opportunity." Chapter 575. After acquiring Disney, Firefly Pictures already had its own music department, but compared to the other major film companies, the scale of the music department obtained from Disney was much smaller. The new World Point Records that Eric set up just to release the single New Divide was negligible. At present, Firefly Pictures was thriving, and the company's income and profits made the other major companies jealous. Except for Eric, who could see the future, perhaps all the other executives of Firefly would be like Katzenberg and agree to expand the music department of Firefly Pictures. Hearing Katzenberg's words just now, Eric did not discourage his enthusiasm. He said, "Jeffrey, Geffen Records is not suitable for us, and we should focus all our resources and energy on the acquisition of the television network. If we want to eat too much in one go, we will often choke." Katzenberg certainly understood this. He nodded on the surface, but he was slightly complaining in his heart. Although he did not know much about the investment companies in New York, he also knew how scattered his boss's energy was. It was said that during the promotion of Jurassic Park, the boss also went to Finland on a whim to acquire a mobile phone company. To be honest, before Katzenberg heard about this, he didn't even know where the small country of Finland was. At this time, it was already after work. After seeing David Geffen off, Eric did not intend to return to the office because he thought of the online music platform while watching Interview with the Vampire at night. Eric planned to go back immediately to check the relevant information. However, when he thought of the large group of people in the office when the two left, Eric raised his finger and pointed to the conference room and asked, "Jeffrey, what's the matter with them?" If it was only the employees of Firefly working overtime, Eric would not find it strange, but he remembered that Neil Jordan, Cruise, and others had not left the conference room. Katzenberg explained, "The company has arranged a small cocktail party for them to celebrate the completion of the movie production. It's in a nearby hotel. David Geffen will definitely show up in the evening." The parties held by Westerners were the same as the university dormitory gatherings in Eric's memory. There were all sorts of reasons. Eric was not surprised and had no intention of participating. After saying goodbye to Katzenberg, Eric returned to Malibu. When Eric wasn't in Los Angeles, Drew didn't usually live there either. There weren't many people in the Pointy Corner Manor other than some basic maintenance staff. Eric couldn't help but take a deep breath as he walked into the spacious and quiet living room of the villa with his suitcase. This was his kingdom, a kingdom of one man. Eric was a person who liked to enjoy solitude. He quietly put his luggage in the bedroom and called for takeout. After dinner, the sky in Los Angeles was completely dark. Eric got into the study, turned on the computer, and began to organize some thoughts that came to him in the afternoon. Eric spared no effort in developing Yahoo's web portal, and the content was very rich. Eric even found an online music sharing website in the websites directory, which surprised him. Because of the strict copyright protection system in the West, this website called Internet Underground Music Archive only had about 100 songs to share. However, Eric found something that interested him. The Internet Underground Music Archive used the MP2 audio format. Needless to say, it was the predecessor of MP3. After organizing some of the information he found into a document, Eric opened his mailbox and began to write an email to Steve Mitnick, the person in charge of Hotmail. Through this period of online communication, Eric had a deeper understanding of the people in charge of the browser company, Yahoo, and Hotmail companies. Eric had decided to merge the Yahoo web portal and Hotmail online mail service before 1995, and the person he chose to be in charge was Steve Mitnick, whom he had yet to meet. After sending the email, Eric stood up and stretched. He walked to the bookshelf and casually took out a novel. He also made himself a pot of coffee, turned off the ceiling light in the study, and sat under the lamp by the window to read quietly. The study's soundproofing was very good, and the sound of the waves couldn't be heard. Occasionally, he would look up and see a layer of silver scales on the surface of the sea under the lights of the Malibu shore. After an unknown period of time, a notification came from the computer's speaker. Eric got up and went to the desk. He turned on the monitor and saw that Steve Mitnick had replied. Steve Mitnick had a very low opinion of the MP2 audio format. In the email, he used a lot of technical terms that Eric didn't understand. However, in the end, the two of them agreed to buy the patent for the MP2 audio format to make technical improvements. In the end, Eric suddenly remembered the instant messaging software that the two of them had talked about. Back then, Steve Mitnick had said that he would be able to complete it in 3 months. Now, it had almost been 3 months. However, after asking, the other party jumped the gun as usual, saying that there were still some details that needed to be improved. Eric had experienced this once during the development of Hotmail, so he wasn't surprised. On account of Hotmail's smooth usage, Eric didn't rush him. After all, this matter wasn't too urgent, so he let the other party do as he pleased. After the discussion, Eric got up and planned to read a little more before going to bed. Suddenly, he found Drew sitting cross-legged on the sofa behind him. She was reading a book intently. Seeing Eric stand up, the little girl threw away the book in her hand and pounced on Eric. With her soft body in his arms, Eric fell back into the leather chair. Eric reached out and hugged the girl's wriggling body. He asked, "When did you come back?" "You scared me." Drew sat on Eric's lap and habitually rubbed against him. She giggled and said, 10 minutes ago. I saw that you were busy, so I didn't disturb you." Oh, my girl suddenly became sensible. "What have you been doing when I wasn't in Los Angeles?" "I'm not crazy. I've been building flower pictures. I rented a 3-story office building in Venice Beach. It's very close to Firefly's base in Playa Vista. How about it?" After 20th Century Fox acquired TG, Drew received $42 million with 30% of the shares. According to Eric's arrangement, Flower Pictures was sold to Drew at a symbolic price. Not bad. You can use the resources of the studio nearby. It's much better than Firefly's headquarters. Burbank's headquarters is too far away from Praia Vista. Hee hee, and guess who I poached to be the CEO of Flower Pictures? Michael Eisner? Eric held back his laughter and pretended to be surprised. He patted the girl's leg and said, "Well done. I've been annoyed with him for a long time. Since he's in your hands, you should teach him a lesson." Drew was dissatisfied with Eric's little joke. He twisted his waist with all his might. "I spent a lot of effort." "No, let's guess again." "There's no hint." "How am I supposed to guess?" Drew said, "It's a woman. You guys know each other." "A woman?" Eric thought for a while and said in surprise, "It can't be Paula Wagner, right?" The only manager that Eric could think of that could match the strength of Flower Pictures was Paula Wagner of the Cruz and Wagner Production Company. He had originally planned to let Nicole poach Cruz's woman, but he didn't expect that the little girl would beat him to it. However, from Drew's stunned expression, Eric realized that he must have guessed wrong. Drew also quickly thought of Paula Wagner's identity and said with some disdain, "No way. What part of her is worth my effort to dig up?" Eric then realized that although Paula Wagner and Tom Cruise had set up their own companies a few years ago, they had not produced any outstanding works like Mission Impossible. In the past 2 years, Cruise's production company could only be said to be lukewarm. There was no highlight in its performance. It really did not seem worth the girl poaching people. "Okay, let's not talk in riddles. Just tell me who it is." "It's Amy Pascal." Eric was really a little surprised. Although Amy Pascal was only a vice president of Columbia, even if Peter Guber made Columbia unable to continue, with Amy Pascal's many years of experience in Hollywood, it would be easy for her to continue as a vice president of any major film company. He did not expect Nicole to trick her into joining Flower Pictures, which had nothing. However, the two were really fated. In the original Spacetime, the Breakin' Doll series was smoothly shot with Amy Pascal's support. "Tell me, how did you trick AI me into your empty shell company?" "I promised her that after 3 years, she would be the CEO of Columbia." "Oh. Isn't that a bit too big?" Nicole blinked innocently. "You wanted me to set up Flower Pictures. Didn't you want me to swallow a major film company?" "That's Columbia. The target I picked for you is MGM, right?" You know, even if 2 years later, Sony realized that Peter Guber had ruined Columbia and wanted to withdraw, with the rapid rise of the Hollywood industry, the price would definitely not be much lower than when Sony fully acquired Columbia. In order to avoid the monopoly, Eric let Nicole take Flower Pictures away from Firefly. His original target was MGM. Compared to the huge Columbia, the broken MGM could easily be acquired with more than $1 billion. "MGM is too lousy, I don't want it." Drew shook her head discontentedly, and then began to change the subject. "Eric, I still have more than 40 million in my hands. Which film do you think I should start with?" Eric felt Nicole's intention to change the subject and no longer pestered her. Anyway, there were only benefits and no harm in bringing Amy Pascal over. As for Nicole's promise, if Eric could consider it, Amy Pascal could also consider it. Since she chose to jump ship from Columbia to help Drew, she must have her own ideas. After so long, Eric almost forgot how many copyrights Drew had collected. After asking, Nicole got up from Eric, ran to the bookshelf, found a folder and handed it to him. "Here, it's all here." Eric was just about to flip through it, but Nicole squeezed on top of Eric again. Fortunately, the leather chair was big enough and Nicole was petite, so it was not crowded when they leaned on each other. Eric pulled the leg of the leather chair to the floor and moved towards the desk. He took a pencil and opened the folder. The two looked at the list of copyrights together. Eric wrote a lot, but because the news was leaked, some of them were stolen, and some of the copyrights were left unsettled. There were not many names on the list. In addition to the Thunderbolt series that had been transferred to DreamWorks, Eric listed the copyrights with the most commercial potential. Mission Impossible, The Bourne Identity, Forrest Gump, The Lord of the Rings. When he saw The Lord of the Rings, Eric was surprised to find that Nicole had taken all the copyrights of Tolkien's works, including The Silmarillion. This was a good thing. In his memory, the original copyright of The Lord of the Rings was obtained by the brothers Mira Mike and Wayne Stan in the early 90s. After some twists and turns, it fell into the hands of New Line. Finally, with the efforts of Peter Jackson, it appeared on the big screen. The whole process took a whole decade. However, New Line's series of hidden income and withholding of profits angered the copyright owner of the Lord of the Rings series. After filming The Hobbit, because Wayne Stan and Wayne did not get the copyright of The Silmarillion, the series was put on hold. Although the copyright owner of The Silmarillion gave a series of high-sounding reasons, in Eric's opinion, the distribution of profits was not agreed. In addition to these 4 copyrights with great commercial potential, Eric also saw the copyright of the original novel, The Shawshank Redemption. Although this movie was an absolute classic, it was not considered a box office hit. It could only be used to compete for the Oscars. In addition to these, the other copyrights were nothing special. They were all brainstormed by Eric at the time. The two leaned together and discussed for a while. Eric felt that the potential brought by these copyrights was definitely not enough to take over Columbia. After pondering for a while, Eric thought of Sony and quickly thought of Spider-Man in the original time and space. Now, the film and television adaptation rights of Spider-Man and some other famous Marvel superheroes were still in the hands of small film companies. If they could take over these rights, not only would it increase the bargaining chip of Flower Pictures, but it would also get the rights of these wandering superheroes in advance. In the future, when they acquired Marvel, they would not have to take the risk of those small companies raising the price to recover the rights. Chapter 576. The next day, Eric personally went to the office building that Drew had rented for Flowers Pictures in Venice Beach in the morning. The 3-story building with a view of the beach and the sea was rented by Drew, and most of the rooms were in the process of being renovated. Eric specially came to talk to Amy Pascal personally about Flowers Pictures. Last night, at the end of the conversation with Drew, the two quickly changed positions under the girl's pestering. There were many things that were not discussed. Since Drew had brought Amy Pascal, the head of Sony Pictures in the original Spacetime, to talk about these things with a more professional person was obviously twice the result with half the effort. In Eric's view, Drew's ability to use people was much better than her in other aspects. For example, Eric had been very puzzled. How did the girl train the Russian twins to be so obedient? The twins were definitely at the combat level, but even when the girl was angry at them, the twins lowered their heads and did not refute, like a pair of docile kittens. When the twins first appeared at Drew's side for a few days, although the two girls always had a cold expression, they did not have the temperament of a boxer at all. Out of curiosity, Eric fought with one of the twins in the Manners gym. Or it could not even be called a fight, because Eric did not even last a minute and raised his hand to surrender. Even then, he got a black eye and was laughed at by the girl for a few days. And now, the girl unexpectedly persuaded Eric to join her Flowers Pictures, which made Eric feel even more surprised than killing a chicken with a butcher's knife. Me, why did you think of messing around with Drew? In the office, Eric asked the question that interested him the most as soon as he saw Amy Pascal in the office. Amy Pascal had a wavy hairstyle and seemed to be in a good mood. When she heard Eric's question, she smiled and said, "Eric, you should know that I came for you. Drew also knows that I came for you. If that's the case, you can come to Firefly. Firefly is in the stage of expansion. If you come over, I will definitely raise both hands in approval. I thought about it when I decided to leave Columbia, but Firefly's management system is already perfect. It would be difficult for me to display my abilities if I joined. But it's different here." Amy Pascal waved her hand gently. "It's like a blank piece of paper here. I can show my abilities to my heart's content, and no one will care that I'm a woman, because the boss of the company is also a woman." Eric looked at Amy Pascal's smug expression and asked, "Do you have a complete plan now?" Of course. Amy Pascal really took out a document from the file cabinet next to her and handed it to Eric. She said, "This is what I prepared these days. I also gave Drew a copy, but I think you just came back yesterday, so she definitely didn't have time to give it to you." Eric flipped open the document and understood why he wanted to seriously discuss the development of Flower Pictures last night, but the little girl seemed to be a little half-hearted. It turned out that she already had a complete plan. Looking at the document that was more than 10 pages long, Eric closed the blue plastic folder and said, "Amy, why don't you explain it briefly?" Amy Pascal didn't object. She said, "I've already studied the copyrights of Flower Pictures. I think there are 2 copyrights that are suitable for Flower Pictures at this stage: Mission Impossible and Bond's Identity." Impossible Mission and Bond's Identity were the names of the TV version of Mission Impossible and the original novel of The Bourne Identity, respectively. In Eric's plan, The Bourne Identity would only be suitable for development in a few years, so it was too early now. However, he did not interrupt Amy Pascal's narration and allowed her to continue. If Flower Pictures can successfully produce a few profitable movies in a few years and have their own stable profitable movie series, then they can expand through listing or issuing bonds. My personal suggestion is that the first step is to work hard to promote the merger of Flower Pictures and MGM. And with Sony and Columbia's situation, I think they will be forced to withdraw from Hollywood in less than 5 years. Amy Pascal looked at Eric meaningfully. Seeing that Eric's expression didn't change at all, she just shrugged and continued, "When the time comes, we can take over Columbia Pictures on the basis of MGM. Of course, the foundation of all this is that the films developed by Flower Pictures can be successful. First of all, in terms of film production funds, I believe that with Eric's endorsement, we can easily obtain funds from Wall Street or European capital, or Firefly can invest personally. But I think you don't want Firefly to participate too much in Flower Pictures, at least not now, right?" Amy Pascal's plan was more meticulous than Eric's original plan. Although Columbia and MGM were subsidiaries of Sony in the original universe, Eric had never thought of letting Flower Pictures acquire these 2 companies. However, the feasibility of this method was definitely more stable than simply using a large sum of money to acquire them. Although Eric originally planned to use Firefly Pictures to acquire MGM's film library in a few years, there was no difference if MGM fell into the hands of Drew or Firefly. Hearing Amy's question, Eric nodded and said, "Before the anti-monopoly law is further relaxed, I really don't want Firefly to get too involved in Flower Pictures. Although everyone knows what's going on, we law-abiding citizens always take the initiative to give the SEC a reason not to trouble us. Also, I hope that the theatrical distribution of Flower Pictures movies will also be represented by other film companies because Firefly's own projects have taken up a lot of publicity resources. Of course, you can rest assured that under any circumstances, Firefly will be the strongest backing of Flower Pictures. I just hope that the situation will never become so bad." Amy Pascal nodded and said, "Before leaving Columbia, I talked to Mr. Goober personally." When it came to Peter Goober, Amy Pascal's eyes showed obvious disgust, but she still said, "Columbia will be responsible for the distribution of Flower Pictures movies, and Mr. Goober promised to give Flower Pictures the most generous terms." After spending half an hour talking about her plan, Amy Pascal said, "So, Eric, now you can talk about your views. Although you haven't refuted me just now, I can also feel that you don't agree with some of my views. I'm definitely not as good as you professionals in terms of company management," Eric said with a smile. "I only want to talk about movies. Although big-budget movies have become the main profit trend in Hollywood, I hope that Flower Pictures can still be involved in low to medium budget independent movie production. The 1990s were the golden decade for independent Hollywood movies. Although most independent movies had become expensive visual garbage, there were still many excellent movies that stood out every year, and there were even more independent movies with high box office." Amy Pascal obviously also understood some of the situation. She nodded and said, "Is there anything else?" "I looked at the list of Flower Pictures' copyright library last night. Impossible Mission, Bourne's Identity, and Tolkien's The Lord of the Rings series are the most valuable copyrights among them. They all have the potential to be developed into a series of movies, but the latter 2 are not suitable for development now. What you can do now is Impossible Mission. I will personally provide an adaptation idea to you." Amy Pascal was a little disappointed. "Eric, is this the only one? In fact, there was originally Forrest Gump. However, if they chose to make Forrest Gump now, then it could only be released next year. In that case, Fox's Braveheart would definitely be a tragedy at the Oscars when compared to Forrest Gump. Not to mention that Tom Hanks was currently filming Saving Private Ryan in Ireland. It was impossible for him to take on other movies in a short period of time. Therefore, Eric still intended to film Forrest Gump next year and release it in 1995. As for what Oscars it would be nominated for, it was not within his scope of consideration. Eric was just about to nod. He hesitated and said, "When I was in Berlin last time, I thought of a very good fantasy movie idea called Night at the Museum. The script has been registered. I can also give this to you." Amy Pascal was surprised and then asked, "Eric, aren't all the scripts you wrote personally developed by Firefly?" Eric said, "Firefly's main movies for the next 3 years have almost been decided." Amy Pascal suddenly remembered the project information that Firefly had already revealed. Saving Private Ryan, True Lies, The Lion King, Jurassic Park 2, Independence Day, Toy Story 2, and so on. In addition, there were a series of movies with Columbia and DreamWorks. It could indeed be said that Firefly's main movies for the next 3 years had been decided. This made her a little envious. She guessed that the other Hollywood film companies had the same mentality. Although other film companies had begun to make big movies in the past 2 years, there were not many successful movies. This was because they did not have the special effects technical support provided by Firefly's Digital Domain Special Effects Company, nor did they have a magical existence like Eric. Even Steven Spielberg, who was the most popular director in the 1980s, was now far behind Eric. Seeing that Amy had no more questions, Eric said, "Then that's it. You can start preparing for Impossible Mission and Night at the Museum now. In addition, you can also choose some small independent movies from well-known directors to invest in." Amy asked, "Eric, do you have any suggestions for the 2 main leads of these 2 projects?" Eric hesitated and said, "I recommend Tom Cruise for the male lead of Impossible Mission, but the condition is that Tom Cruise can only participate in this project as an actor and has to sign a contract for at least 3 movies. As for Night at the Museum..." Eric thought for a while and realized that Ben Stiller was not famous yet. Other than Ben Stiller, Eric could only think of Jim Carrey. However, although Jim Carrey was very suitable for the male lead of Night at the Museum, Eric was not very interested in working with Jim Carrey. Choose from the more famous comedians. The specific situation will be decided based on the actor's schedule and the results of the audition. This movie focuses on the miraculous resurrected creatures in the museum, so the male lead is not the most important. Amy Pascal nodded, then suddenly shook her head and said, "Eric, although Cruise's career has declined in the past 2 years, if he wants to sign a contract for 3 movies at once, I'm afraid it's not that simple. I've dealt with Cruise during the production of Dark War, the prequel. He's not that kind of person. I'm afraid he'll ask his production company to participate in this project." "I understand. You can try to get in touch with him. It won't bring us any losses. If he agrees, it'll be for the best. We can also make some concessions in terms of salary. But if he insists on participating too much, then it's not impossible to find a star who can replace him in Hollywood. I'll talk to him." Amy Pascal nodded and recorded these things in a memo. Eric waited for her to finish writing before saying, "Now let's talk about another very important thing." Amy Pascal saw Eric's very serious look and immediately raised her head. "I suddenly thought of this last night. Some time ago, I asked someone to investigate Marvel Comics superheroes. Eric, are you planning to develop a superhero movie like Warner?" "I don't have this plan at the moment," Eric said. "I mean, some time ago, I asked someone to investigate the copyright of some of Marvel Comics' leading superheroes, including Spider-Man, Captain America, and Fantastic Four. These superheroes' copyrights are in the hands of some second-rate or third-rate companies, so I want you to buy them back for me." Amy Pascal thought about the information of Marvel superheroes and said, "Eric, it said that there are many Marvel superheroes. It's not so easy to get them all back. Then, at least get Spider-Man back. In fact, I'm most interested in this superhero." Amy Pascal smiled and said, "Spider-Man is one of Marvel's most popular superheroes. If I were to choose, of course, it would be Spider-Man." Chapter 577. After talking with Amy Pascal, Eric temporarily let go of the Flower Pictures matter. After Halloween, it was November 1993. The total box office of Jurassic Park worldwide was getting closer and closer to $1 billion. As a result, it once again caused a heated discussion in the media after breaking the box office record of E.T. These days, Eric lived a busy life shuttling back and forth between different sets or studios. While checking the preparation or production progress of Firefly's big-budget films, Eric also had to take care of the acquisition of the TV network and attend some party invitations that he couldn't refuse from time to time. Fortunately, Firefly's film publicity department was very mature and perfect. Under the control of Michael Lynn, Katzenberg, and others, Eric didn't need to worry about the release of the film at the end of the year. Otherwise, he would be even busier. After another day of work, Eric watched the shooting progress of Men in Black and walked out of the Columbia Pictures studio in Culver City with Peter Guber. Just as he was about to get in the car and leave, the mobile phone he carried with him rang. The phone call was from Michael Lynn. The two spoke briefly on the phone. Eric dismissed the idea of returning to Malibu and told the driver to go to the headquarters of Firefly Pictures in Burbank. Walking into a conference room at the headquarters of Firefly in Burbank, Eric found that Michael Lynn, Jeffrey Katzenberg, and other Firefly executives had already appeared here. However, Eric was keenly aware that there was a faint joy on these people's faces, so he let go of his original worries. After a simple greeting, Eric sat down in his seat and asked with a smile, "Is there any good news?" Michael Lynn, who was sitting next to Eric, handed a document to Eric and said with some excitement, "The latest box office statistics have been released. The latest box office data of Jurassic Park is $102.3 million. Eric, your prediction has come true. Because today is Wednesday, the box office data for this weekday will only be calculated on Friday, so most people don't know about this data yet. However, we can announce this news tomorrow." Eric flipped open the document and saw the box office data of more than 50 countries in the table, as well as the eye-catching $1 billion at the end of the table. He nodded in satisfaction, put the document aside, and asked Michael Lynn, "I don't think you called me over in such a hurry just for this matter, right? Let Jeffrey do it." Michael Lynn pointed at Katzenberg. Katzenberg handed over an envelope and said, "Eric, we just received this afternoon. It's a letter from Warren Buffett. Take a look." Eric was not too surprised to hear Buffett's name. Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway was one of the major shareholders of ABC TV. He held more than 25% of ABC's shares. If Firefly wanted to acquire ABC, it was impossible to bypass Buffett. Opening the envelope, there was only a simple piece of paper inside. The content was very simple. Buffett wanted to invite Eric to Omaha to talk about ABC. There was no seal or postmark on the envelope. Obviously, the letter was handed over by someone else and not sent through the mail. After reading the message, Eric looked up and said, "Have you all read it?" Michael and the others nodded at the same time. Katzenberg was the main person in charge of the ABC acquisition. At this time, he said, "From this letter, it can be seen that Buffett has already discovered our intentions." Eric folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. He asked, "Jeffrey, how have things been going on your side recently?" Katzenberg said, "In order to avoid attracting too much attention, we have also bought the shares of 3 major TV stations in the secondary market. At present, we have about 7% of ABC's shares in our hands. The other two have less than 5%. ABC's share price has also risen from $43 3 months ago to $47. Now the total market value is $9.67 billion. Firefly's original plan was to buy about 10% of ABC's shares and then publicly announce the news and join the ABC board of directors. But now that Buffett was aware of this matter, it would not be so easy to carry out the original plan. Eric thought for a moment and said, "Sell all the shares of the other 2 companies as soon as possible. Tomorrow, announce that the box office of Jurassic Park has broken $1 billion. In addition, send a reply letter to Mr. Buffett and invite him to the celebration of the global box office of Jurassic Park, breaking $1 billion. Eric, this might not be enough to take the initiative, Frank Wales, who had been silent all this while, said. Although Berkshire Hathaway only has 25% of ABC's shares, ABC's chairman, Tom Murphy, is also a major shareholder and a good friend of Warren Buffett. I think if we want to buy it, you'd better go to Omaha in person. After Frank Wales finished speaking, although the executives in the conference room who were over 50 years old did not speak, Eric could still see a look of approval from Jeffrey, Michael Lynn, and others. For their generation, Buffett was a legend of wealth. Eric could also understand their admiration for Buffett. However, Eric had other considerations. During this period, Eric had put a lot of effort into preparing for the acquisition of the TV network. It was impossible for Eric not to know anything about Buffett, who directly controlled a lot of ABC's shares. Buffett was definitely a person who planned before acting. If he had not made a decision, Eric believed that he would never have received Buffett's invitation today. At the same time, Buffett was absolutely rational when it came to investing. Eric believed that Buffett would not easily change his attitude toward him because of the change in home ground. In addition to these, Eric certainly wanted to take the initiative. Although Michael Lynn and others were not optimistic about it, Eric would not give it a try. Okay, it's decided. Everyone, get ready. Eric waved his hand gently and completely settled this matter. The next day, Firefly announced that the global box office of Jurassic Park had exceeded 1 billion yuan. However, the celebration party was scheduled a week later. The reason for this was mainly to leave enough time for him to sell NBC and CBS shares. At the same time, after receiving a reply from Firefly, Buffett, as Eric expected, accepted the invitation to the celebration party of Jurassic Park. As the New Year's Thanksgiving Day approached, the Thanksgiving-Christmas period also opened at the same time. Firefly released the last film with Jim Carrey, Detective Jet 2, on November 19th. Unsurprisingly, it earned nearly $30 million in box office in 3 days in the first weekend. Interview with the Vampire and Quentin's Pulp Fiction, which were mainly responsible for the Oscars, were scheduled to be released in December. Columbia Pictures also released Wu Bei's second film in Hollywood, Broken Arrow, in the same week. The film's results were not as good as last year's Mr. and Mrs. Smith, but perhaps due to the influence of last year's Mr. and Mrs. Smith, Wu Bei had accumulated a good foundation of popularity in North America. Broken Arrow also earned $32 million in box office in 3 days in the first weekend. Because the film's production cost was relatively low, as long as it was less than $50 million, there was no problem in recouping the cost. However, what surprised many people was that the box office dark horse at the end of the year was not Detective Jet 2, Broken Arrow, or any of the other films. Instead, it was My Fair Dad, which was released by 20th Century Fox with a production cost of only $20 million. This family comedy starring Robin Williams earned nearly $20 million in box office in 3 days, and it was very well received. The Box Office Statistics Agency estimated that the box office in North America would earn an astonishing $200 million, 10 times the production cost of the film. Because of this, Elizabeth couldn't help but raise her chin when she saw Eric. She had a proud look on her face until she was taught a lesson by Eric. On November 22nd, near the evening, although the celebration party had not yet started, the Point Manor was already full of people. Eric pulled Jeffrey to a seat in the open-air field outside the villa and joked, "Jeffrey, I think it's your biggest mistake to insist that I hold the Jurassic Park celebration party at the Point Manor. You have to know that Warren Buffett is a very frugal person, and he hates the extravagance of the rich. Maybe he won't be willing to sell us ABC after seeing everything here." Buffett's good friend and business partner, Charlie Munger, not only has his own private jet, but he also owns a private island. I don't see Buffett cutting ties with him. As far as I know, Buffett is indeed a frugal person, but he won't force others to do the same. Well, Eric, I know you don't like to have parties in your own manner, but today is different, isn't it? Even without Warren Buffett, today is the celebration party for the global box office of Jurassic Park, breaking $1 billion. Even this is worthy of a serious celebration. As the two were chatting, Drew, who was wearing a beautiful red dress, came over with Amy Pascal. The little girl hugged Jeffrey affectionately and went to Eric's side. Jeffrey noticed that Amy Pascal seemed to have something to talk to Eric, so he took the initiative to get up and walk away. Eric motioned Amy Pascal to sit down and asked, "Amy, what's the matter?" Amy Pascal said, "We recently contacted Carlock Films, the owner of the copyright of Spider-Man, but the other party did not agree to transfer the copyright to us." Eric recalled and asked, "Is Mario Kassar still in charge of Carlock Films?" Amy Pascal nodded and said, "Since the failure of the box office of Bear Peak of the Mountain and Last Action Hero during the summer, Carlock Films has been in a state of semi-bankruptcy in the past 6 months. However, when I contacted Mario Kassar, he directly rejected our intention to buy the copyright of Spider-Man as soon as I told him my intention." "That's all?" Eric asked. Amy Pascal said, "Of course not. He said he could cooperate with us to develop Spider-Man, but he would never sell Spider-Man to us." "He must have guessed that you're the mastermind behind this." The little girl rubbed against Eric's body and giggled heartlessly. Eric pulled the little girl's ear and pushed her away. After thinking for a moment, he said, "What form did Carlock buy the copyright of Spider-Man in?" "It seems to have been bought for 5 years, from 1990 to 1995. However, I also found some ancillary clauses. Within 5 years, if Carlock Films develops a Spider-Man movie, then the copyright will automatically extend for 5 years. Also, the copyright transfer contract for Captain America and Fantastic Four is similar to Spider-Man." "This is a very troublesome matter." Eric thought for a moment. He remembered that in the original space-time, Carlock Films went bankrupt around 1995. Then the copyright of Spider-Man automatically returned to Marvel Comics. Because Marvel Comics happened to be in an extremely difficult period, they had to sell it to Sony Pictures again. Since then, because of the success of the big movie developed by Sony, the return of Spider-Man has become far away. Eric quickly thought of something else and asked, "Where are the main shares of Carlock Films now?" "I'm not sure about that, but the controlling shares should be in the hands of some investment funds on Wall Street." "Eric, I'm worried that if Mario Kassar reveals this matter, it is likely to attract other film companies to compete for the copyright of Spider-Man, and Marvel Comics may also be in trouble." Eric did not answer Amy's concerns and asked, "How much would it cost if we bought Carlock Films?" "Probably tens of millions of dollars. Although Carlock Films has produced and released a lot of movies in recent years, not many of them have been successful. Otherwise, they would not be in a semi-bankrupt state now. You collect the relevant information. If Mario Kassar insists on not letting go, then buy Carlock Films as a whole. I think those people on Wall Street are very happy to cash in this mess now." Amy asked the question she had just asked, "But what if they realize that you are interested in the copyright of Spider-Man?" Eric shook his head and said with a smile, "Don't worry, now is not the time to develop Spider-Man. Superhero movies have very high requirements for special effects. Otherwise, do you think the 7 major film companies would let Marvel comic superheroes fall into the hands of second- or third-rate film companies? So, even if other film companies snatch it away, it won't be a big problem. At worst, I'll launch another acquisition at that time. I still have many years." Chapter 578. Drew had been quietly listening to the two of them discuss how to get the copyrights of Spider-Man and other superheroes. When she heard that Eric even had the idea of buying Carlock Pictures, the little girl couldn't help but laugh out loud. She looked overjoyed. Eric looked at Drew and asked, "Is it funny?" "Of course, it's just the copyright of Spider-Man. If Carlock wants to jointly develop it, it doesn't have to be this movie. We can exchange the investment rights of Mission Impossible or Night at the Museum with them. Anyway, we need financing." Spider-Man in the original spacetime was so successful that Eric subconsciously felt that he had to increase his chips if he wanted to obtain the copyrights of this superhero. Hearing Drew's words, he suddenly felt enlightened. Amy Pascal said, "Drew, I've also considered this possibility. However, film companies usually use debt financing for films that they are very optimistic about. This way, after the movie is sold, they only need to repay the principal and interest of the debt. They don't need to share the copyrights and benefits with others. We didn't plan to distribute the movie ourselves. In this case, we already need to give up a part of the distribution share. If we follow your idea and introduce Carlock and other film companies to co-produce, we will be able to get even less profit. Okay, then pretend I didn't say anything. Drew shrugged indifferently, picked up a glass of juice on the table and drank it by himself. Amy noticed Eric's expression and said, "Eric, are you really going to do this?" "I think this is a good idea. Let's do it." Eric looked at Amy Pascal with a reluctant expression and said, "Amy, I promise you, you will never regret it in the future." Of course, Amy Pascal didn't know if she would regret it in the future, but since Eric had spoken, she had to agree. "Okay, Eric, if they ask to share the copyrights, should I agree? We can slightly increase the investment ratio, but we can't share the copyrights. Mission Impossible and Night at the Museum are both series of movies. We have to ensure that the launch of the sequel and the choice of the protagonist are completely up to us. If it really doesn't work, we can make some small concessions in the investment of the sequel." Eric wouldn't make the mistake of Paramount and Cruise working together to develop Mission Impossible. In the original spacetime, because Cruise held half of the copyrights of Mission Impossible, Paramount didn't even have the right to change the protagonist after breaking up with Cruise. In the end, they had to pinch their nose and invite Cruise back. Just as Eric was about to ask Amy Pascal about the conversation with Cruise, he saw Nicole walking towards them from not far away. Eric waved at Nico and stood up to greet her. The little girl next to him was the first to float to Nico's side and hug her tall figure. She even rubbed against Nico's body with an overly enthusiastic look. "Hi, Nico, wow, I didn't expect your skin to be so beautiful now. I'm so envious. I must find time to go to Africa." "Thank you for your compliment, Drew," Nico said, but she unceremoniously reached out and pulled Drew away from her body and walked towards Eric. "Hi, Nico." Eric also stepped forward and hugged Nico. Because there were many guests around, the two of them didn't do anything intimate. Amy Pascal greeted Nicole and tactfully walked to another place. Drew didn't leave. The three of them sat down at the small round table. Eric poured a glass of red wine and handed it to Nico. He asked, "How did it feel to film in Morocco?" Nico had a look of lingering fear on her face. That place was terrible, and there was even a war. During the entire filming process, we lived with 500 soldiers sent by the local government. The only fortunate thing was that we didn't encounter any attacks during the entire filming process. You know, we stayed in a small town for 5 days. As soon as we left, we heard that the town was ransacked by the government army the next day. Eric didn't know much about the political situation in North Africa, but he also knew that choosing to film in Morocco could save Universal at least $10 million in production costs. "I think as long as the first film of The Mummy is a success, Michael Eisner definitely won't let you film in Morocco for the sequel. Of course, I'd rather give up the role in the sequel than go back to that godforsaken place," Nico said as she touched her tan skin. Based on her understanding of Drew, when the girl just said that her skin was beautiful, she would definitely hear the opposite. And from Eric's reaction, it could be seen that most Westerners advocated a healthy tan. After Nico returned to Los Angeles, many of her friends praised her skin color for becoming beautiful. Only Eric was indifferent to such an obvious change. The few of them chatted, and the sky unknowingly darkened. The lights in the manor lit up, and more guests came to the party. Eric had to get up and entertain some important guests. By 7 o'clock, most of the guests had arrived. Eric brought the main creators of Jurassic Park to the villa's hall to break the ice sculpture that symbolized the billion-dollar box office. The party officially began. Although it was close to Thanksgiving, many of Eric's women stayed in Los Angeles. In addition to Nico and Drew, Famke Janssen and the Cruz sisters all appeared at the party. Eric thought that Jennifer Connelly would rush home to have Thanksgiving with her parents, but he didn't expect the girl to also rush over. After returning to Los Angeles, Eric didn't have time to see Julia and Emma, so he specially called Julia to bring Emma to the party. So, Julia used Elizabeth's invitation as an excuse to escape to New York with Emma and Elizabeth. Eric didn't know whether to laugh or cry. Eric was sure that Julia's condition was absolutely hopeless. He didn't have any hope for her, but Julia was like a little sparrow whose legs were tied up but not locked in a cage. She looked at the open sea and sky and tried to flap her wings from time to time. After socializing at the party, Eric looked at his watch. It was almost 8 o'clock, but Buffett hadn't arrived yet. Just as he was about to ask if something had happened, he saw many female guests gathered on a sofa by the villa's glass wall. They were chatting and laughing about something. What surprised Eric even more was that all his women were there. Perhaps this was also the reason why no tactful male guests came forward to strike up a conversation with a group of gorgeously dressed women. Nico happened to notice Eric looking in their direction in surprise. She discreetly broke away from the crowd and walked over. When Nico approached, Eric asked curiously, "What are you talking about?" "Gossip, clothes, cosmetics, men." Nico giggled. "Anyway, we'll talk about whatever you men aren't interested in. Actually, men are very interested in it, especially the last thing you mentioned. Can you tell me a little about it secretly?" Nico winked mischievously. "Of course not." Eric shrugged and said with a smile, "All right then, I'll find some time to interrogate you with torture." Nico's face turned slightly red, but she didn't say anything else. She reached out her small hand to Eric. "Let's go dance, okay?" Eric shook his head apologetically. "I'm waiting for an important guest. I'm afraid I can't accompany you." Nico curled her lips and acted coquettishly, but she tactfully didn't pester him. Just as she was about to leave, Eric pulled Nico and whispered in her ear, "Help me tell them to stay tonight." Nico thought that Eric was going to whisper something to her. When she heard this, she immediately rolled her eyes at him and said helplessly, "I'm only responsible for passing the message. It's none of my business if they don't want to stay." "Of course." Eric was about to tease her again when he saw Jeffrey waving at him from not far away. Eric realized that Buffett might have arrived. He nodded at Nico and hurried over to Jeffrey. Eric brought Jeffrey, Katzenberg, and the others to the parking lot. They saw an old man in his 60s with silver hair and tortoiseshell glasses getting out of a black Mercedes-Benz. "Hello, Mr. Buffett." Eric reached out his hand and couldn't help but look at this legendary tycoon again. On the list of the world's richest people, most of the tycoons accumulated amazing wealth through a company or a product. For example, Bill Gates, who made his fortune through Microsoft, or Larry Ellison, who became rich through database software. Only Warren Buffett relied on diversified investment methods and repeatedly climbed to the throne of the world's richest man. "Eric, it's nice to meet you." Warren Buffett shook Eric's hand enthusiastically. "I'm really sorry. Something happened, so I came a little late." "It's okay, Mr. Buffett. Let me introduce you." Eric introduced Katzenberg and the others one by one. Then, surrounded by the crowd, they walked to the villa together. When they saw Eric solemnly walking to the parking lot with a group of executives from Firefly, they had already realized that an important person had arrived. When the guests found out that this person was Warren Buffett, many of them showed a look of surprise and understanding. After Eric and Buffett disappeared from the villa, some of the guests couldn't wait to run to the corner and take out their mobile phones to spread the news to the outside world. Obviously, since the major shareholder of ABC was here, Firefly Pictures' goal of acquiring the network was self-evident. When this news was released tomorrow, it would definitely affect many things. For example, the stock prices of NBC and CBS, which have been rising recently, would definitely come to an abrupt halt. There might even be a drop in their stock prices. On the other hand, ABC's stock prices would definitely have the opposite effect. Most of the people attending the party tonight were people in the Hollywood circle. Not many people had interacted with Buffett before, so Eric brought Buffett directly to his study. "Eric, when Firefly acquired Disney, I actually wanted to meet you. Unfortunately, I didn't have the chance. You know, I was a shareholder of Disney." Eric poured 2 cups of Coca-Cola that he had prepared beforehand and handed one to Buffett. He sat down on the sofa opposite him and said, "Actually, Mr. Buffett, I, like many people, admire your investment methods very much. I even considered buying some Berkshire shares." Buffett rubbed the cup of Coke in his hand with great interest and said, "If you want to invest, of course I'd welcome you. Before coming here, I've seen all the films you've participated in. Although I don't like some of them very much, it is undeniable that they are all commercial films with great box office potential. I'm curious, how did you create or choose these scripts?" "Based on my personal feelings. We all know that film investment is like gambling. Before a film is released, no one can know whether it will be popular with the audience. Otherwise, the one who made Star Wars would not have been George Lucas." Eric's explanation would never satisfy Buffett, but Buffett did not have the slightest intention of delving into it. In the small house in Omaha, he had been thinking about this young man for a long time. Eric was like a favorite kissed by the goddess of luck. Since his rapid rise in 1988, this young man had not made any mistakes in investment or film. Although he was unwilling to admit it, Buffett felt that Eric should be the same kind of person as him. Since the 1960s, Buffett had been picking and choosing from different investment portfolios. The reason why he was able to accumulate nearly $10 billion worth of wealth today was also because he had never made a huge investment mistake over the years. Therefore, since Firefly announced that it would withdraw its shares from Fox, Buffett had been paying close attention to Firefly's every move. On the day that Firefly announced that it would compete with Viacom for the Blockbuster chain, Buffett realized from a series of clues that Firefly's real goal was not Blockbuster. "Eric, I'm curious. The video industry's annual growth is absolutely no less than the movie box office, but the development of the TV network has been in a slump for a long time. Why didn't you choose Blockbuster, but buy ABC instead?" Since Buffett had already come to him, Eric did not explain anymore. He said, "I remember you once said that when others are greedy, I'm afraid, and when others are afraid, I'm greedy. Is that right?" Buffett smiled, indicating that he agreed. Right now, the development of the video industry is at a point where everyone should be greedy for profits, and the TV network happens to be the kind of existence that makes many people flinch. So, I don't think it's that surprising to choose to buy ABC, right? Chapter 579. Buffett was very optimistic about the video rental industry. For this reason, he had studied Blockbuster in detail. Since the mid-1980s, the video rental industry's profits were no less than the movie box office. Blockbuster, with 3,000 branches, was undoubtedly the Walmart of the video rental industry. Blockbuster's annual profit last year was not much less than the 7 major Hollywood studios. Moreover, this video rental giant had a huge amount of cash flow that Buffett was most interested in. The video rental industry had been thriving over the years, but Buffett did not think there was a bubble in this industry. Therefore, Eric's contempt for Blockbuster made Buffett very confused. "Eric, don't you think the video rental industry has a bright future? The video rental and DVD rental industry would flourish for at least a decade." Of course, Eric was optimistic about this industry. What he was not optimistic about was the Blockbuster chain's business model that would be quickly eliminated in a few years. "Mr. Buffett." Eric had just opened his mouth when Buffett gently interrupted him. He smiled and said gently, "Eric, you can call me Warren. I don't want our communication to be like a formal business negotiation. What do you think?" "Okay, Warren." Eric nodded with a smile. If you've been to some of the Blockbuster rental chain stores, you'll find that it's very troublesome to find some videotapes. Also, Blockbuster's various charges are very unreasonable. I believe that if a better video rental business model appears, Blockbuster's elimination is almost inevitable. Buffett did not act like a tycoon at all. He continued to ask, "I think you must have considered a better business model?" Of course, for example, on the internet, we can set up a dedicated video rental website. If customers want a certain movie, they only need to enter the name of the movie on the website, and they can easily find the detailed rental information of the related movie. We can even set up a dedicated mail system to make it more convenient for customers to rent videos. Buffett did not pay much attention to the high-tech industry. This could be seen from his investment portfolio. Berkshire Hathaway was basically involved in the traditional industry. However, because of the information superhighway plan that was being vigorously promoted by the Clinton administration, Buffett was exposed to a lot of relevant information. Buffett keenly grasped the key point of Eric's plan. Eric, don't you think there are too few internet users now? Eric had not been paying attention to the growth of internet users in North America recently, but he quickly found a similar example. There aren't too many internet users, but users who can log on to the internet often have considerable spending power. Moreover, when personal computers were first introduced more than a decade ago, perhaps no one realized that these expensive and seemingly useless household appliances can now be sold in the millions every year. In the past decade, tens of millions of users in North America and even the world have accumulated personal computers. These people's financial strength is usually not too bad. As the internet content becomes more and more abundant, I believe most people will choose to participate in the internet. In the process of studying Eric's personal information, Buffett also deliberately logged on to the Yahoo portal and set up his own online email account. Although many people thought that his personal style was very conservative, Buffett was a person who never forgot to learn and accept new things. He felt that an online email was indeed much faster than an email. However, due to the limitations of various hardware and software conditions, Buffett couldn't think of the profit prospects of these online services. Buffett had always been an investor who pursued profits, and he strictly adhered to the principle that investment must be returned. If he invested tens of millions of dollars but couldn't get a return, he couldn't think of any reason to continue doing something. Eric, before I came, I saw the Yahoo portal you invested in. What I want to know is, did you establish this website for investment or purely for public welfare? Of course it's for investment. Eric felt that Buffett had obviously led the conversation astray. Today, they were supposed to discuss the acquisition of the television network by Firefly. However, Eric was also very clear that Buffett was a person who had a strong desire to ask questions. He could see from a lot of Buffett's information that when Buffett was interested in a company, he would often tirelessly bombard the person in charge of the company with questions. However, Eric did not have any intention of being impatient. In fact, many business transactions were determined in this kind of back-and-forth chat. As for the kind of business negotiation that was often done after the transaction intent was reached, the details were often negotiated. Then, for example, the Yahoo portal, when do you plan to make it profitable, and how do you plan to make it profitable? In the past few years, I've never thought that Yahoo could make a profit. It's still in the market nurturing stage, Eric replied slowly. Warren, can you imagine, if Yahoo has more than 100 million users, how much would the advertisers be willing to pay to advertise on Yahoo's website? 100 million users. Buffett narrowed his eyes slightly. He did not take Eric's words as a fantasy. As Eric just said, 10 years ago, no one knew that personal computers could be sold in the millions every year. If the number of internet users really increased by millions or even tens of millions every year in the future, then 100 million users would not be a far-fetched goal. Because of the advertising revenue of newspaper media, Berkshire owned many newspapers, but the largest of them, the Washington Post, only had a daily circulation of a few million copies. However, even these few million copies could generate hundreds of millions of dollars of profit for the Washington Post Company every year. Therefore, if the internet media with 100 million users found a suitable way to make a profit, the profits would definitely exceed any traditional paper media. Although Buffett was not an impulsive person, he was obviously tempted at this time. However, this was not enough for him to immediately jump into the internet wave. After thinking quickly for a moment, Buffett took a few sips of Coke in front of him and gently put down the cup. He looked at Eric and said, "Eric, the prospects you described are indeed very attractive. I look forward to the future of Yahoo. Then, let's talk about the TV network. I heard you talk to Barry Diller a few days ago?" "Yes," Eric showed a regretful expression and said honestly, but unfortunately, he did not plan to join Firefly. Buffett's expression remained unchanged. "Then, if I agree to sell ABC to you, how do you plan to deal with Tom? You know, we are good friends, and I need to consider the interests of my friends. If we can successfully acquire ABC, Firefly will not make too many changes to ABC's personnel, and the performance of ABC in the past few years is enough to prove Mr. Tom Murphy's management ability. Therefore, in the next few years, Firefly will mainly increase the investment in ABC's content. We all know that the TV network is also like a sales platform, and TV programs are the goods it sells. Any customer at the same price will be more willing to patronize stores with higher quality products. Buffett was obviously satisfied with Eric's answer, and he began to ask other questions that he was concerned about, which involved various problems that might arise after Eric acquired the TV network in the future. The two men seemed to be chatting about an insignificant matter from beginning to end, and they never talked about the most important issue of the acquisition price. After more than an hour, the two of them finished a large bottle of Coke. Finally, Buffett said, "Eric, overall, I'm quite satisfied with the various plans you've made after acquiring the television network. So, we can now talk about the acquisition price." Buffett and Tom Murphy now owned most of the shares of ABC, which meant that as long as these two people nodded, Firefly Pictures would hardly encounter much resistance to acquiring ABC. However, Eric was not too relaxed at this time, because he had realized something else. If Buffett only intended to sell ABC to Firefly for cash, he would not talk to him for so long. Maybe he would just give a price very directly. Sure enough, Buffett immediately said, "Eric, although I'm optimistic about this deal, I don't intend to cash out all of ABC's shares. Tom and I have already talked about this. We will only sell 30% of ABC's shares in a cash transaction at most, and I hope to use the other 70% as capital to invest in Firefly Pictures." Eric had already expected Buffett's intentions. From the bottom of his heart, he did not want to exchange in the form of cash and shares, but now it was different from when he acquired Disney. When Firefly acquired Disney, Disney's performance was in a slump, and Firefly, which was not very large at that time, completely swallowed Disney like a snake swallowing an elephant. Most investors were not very optimistic about the acquisition of Firefly. In addition, Disney did not have a major shareholder like ABC, and the shares were quite scattered, so Firefly Pictures was able to realize the cash acquisition. But in the past 2 years, the performance of Firefly Pictures was too dazzling. Although this year's financial report had not been released, there was almost no suspense about the net profit exceeding $1 billion. At present, except for the Time Warner Group, which was larger than Firefly, no other film company in Hollywood could achieve such annual profits. Therefore, the investment institutions all over the world had been focusing their attention on Firefly Pictures, always looking forward to Firefly Pictures' announcements such as going public. In this case, Firefly wanted to expand into the television network. Whether it was ABC, or the slightly weaker NBC and CBS, they would certainly not give up this great opportunity to invest in Firefly. As for Buffett's proposal to invest in Firefly with 70% of ABC's shares, Eric was not in a hurry to bargain. Instead, he asked, "So, Warren, I want to know, how much of Firefly Pictures do you plan to exchange 70% of ABC's shares for?" 49%, Buffett answered quickly. Apparently, he had thought about it for a long time. "Eric, we can calculate it using ABC's current stock price. ABC's valuation is about $10 billion. As for Firefly Pictures, I'll give it a valuation of $15 billion. And I know you will never give up the absolute control of Firefly Pictures, so we don't ask for control. You will still be the largest shareholder, and I will not intervene in the management of Firefly in the future. What do you think?" "What, of course not." Although Firefly's business was not as extensive as Time Warner's, Firefly's annual profits were definitely comparable to Time Warner's. Although many people, according to the normal development trajectory of Hollywood film companies, would certainly think that this profit margin was only temporary, Eric was very confident that Firefly could maintain a high growth state for a long time. Even without a television network, Firefly's future profits would only continue to rise. After all, the movies and TV series produced by a film company were also a kind of product, and Eric had an unparalleled ability to produce and select high-quality products. "Warren, this price is too high. I definitely won't agree." Eric did not beat around the bush and said directly, "Firefly's net profit last year was close to $1 billion, and this year, it may even surpass Time Warner's. And we all know that Time Warner's market value is close to $30 billion, and Firefly's valuation is only $15 billion. Don't you think this is too low?" "Eric, I admit that Firefly's performance in recent years has been very dazzling, but we also know very well that the return on investment in the film industry is very unstable. Although everyone recognizes your talent in the film industry, this does not mean that you will not fail in the future, just like Spielberg. Hollywood's entire 80s was Spielberg's world, but just as we entered the 90s, Spielberg ushered in the failure of Captain Hawk. Moreover, we also know very well that a company's market value cannot be calculated simply based on the profits of a few years. Time Warner has film, television, publishing, music, and other industries under its banner, which means that its ability to resist risks is very high. Even if there is a major loss in a certain business in a certain year, it will not affect Time Warner's overall revenue. But Firefly's business scope is relatively narrow, and businesses such as peripheral income are very dependent on the film's performance. Chapter 580. When Eric and Buffett walked out of the study, it was already past midnight. Although many guests wanted to wait for Eric and Buffett to appear again to inquire about the news, they had no choice but to leave in disappointment after the party ended. At this time, in addition to the party company's staff who were cleaning up the scene, there were only the main executives of Firefly and the women who were hiding. Eric and Buffett had just walked down the stairs when Jeffrey and the others, who were chatting in the living room, came up to them. Although they wanted to know the result immediately, they still politely sent Buffett off. When Buffett's car left the manor, Eric immediately looked at the crowd and shrugged. Buffett has the intention to sell ABC, but we have a big disagreement on the price. After this sentence, no one showed any disappointment. Of course, they weren't excited about Buffett's intention to sell ABC. It would be strange if a deal involving tens of billions of dollars could be settled in one night. Eric told the other executives to leave first, leaving only Michael Lynn, Jeffrey, Katzenberg, and Frank Wales, the four giants of Firefly Pictures. The five of them came to the living room where everyone had been chatting and sat down. Eric saw Drew, who had changed out of her evening dress and was wearing a t-shirt and shorts, poking her head into the living room. He said, "We still have to talk for a while. You guys go and rest first." Although in English, you and you guys were the same word, the expressions of the other four instantly became a bit ambiguous. They all knew that Eric's you referred to them and not him. Therefore, even Jeffrey, who was relatively pure, couldn't help but envy Eric's luck with women. Drew nodded obediently. "Okay, do you guys want coffee? I'll get Natasha to make it." Although many people could see the Russian twins shuttling back and forth in the villa tonight, Eric didn't want to provoke the four men with the sisters. He pointed to the coffee machine in the corner of the living room. "It's so late. Don't let them do everything. You do it yourself." Drew made a face at Eric, but still obediently walked to the coffee machine and started working. While the little girl was brewing coffee, Eric briefly recounted the outcome of his conversation with Buffett to the four people around him. "That's about it. I also gave them the acquisition plan for Firefly, and then..." Eric spread his hands. Nothing was settled. Although he understood that the cash acquisition plan was not feasible, Eric still proposed a fully owned acquisition plan. Just like Eric's reaction when he heard Buffett's plan, Buffett rejected it immediately. Although both of them knew very well in their hearts that their acquisition plans were not the bottom line of either party, neither of them would make any concessions in the first informal contact. To put it simply, the only thing Eric and Buffett gained from tonight was that they both had the intention to make this deal. Therefore, the long tug-of-war had only just begun. After Eric finished speaking, the five people in the living room were silent for a while, each digesting the information that Eric had just revealed. Drew made coffee and gently placed a few cups of coffee on the coffee table in front of them. She leaned over and kissed Eric on the cheek, then carefully closed the door and left the living room. After a while, Katzenberg spoke first. "Eric, I think the biggest problem is that Buffett doesn't recognize the actual market value of Firefly. This is not surprising. Although our profits last year were comparable to Time Warner, most of our profits came from movies and their derivatives. Most people know that the movie business fluctuates greatly. But Buffett has always been known for being cautious and conservative when it comes to investing, so his views don't represent everyone. I think that if we don't want to be at a disadvantage in this deal, the first thing we need to do is to stop keeping a low profile. It's necessary to properly show Firefly's strength to the media. After Katzenberg said that, the other three nodded in agreement. Frank Wales didn't forget to add, "Eric, I think you have to get first place on Forbes magazine's rankings this year. Furthermore, you have to be like Sam Walton from a few years ago. You have to leave second place far behind." Before Sam Walton's death in 1992, the market value of the Walmart chain had reached more than $40 billion. The Walton family owned more than 40% of Walmart's shares. Before 1992, Sam Walton was the only rich person on the Forbes 400 list with a wealth of more than $10 billion. After Sam Walton's death, the family's wealth was divided equally among his wife and 4 children. But because of the use of reasonable means to avoid a large amount of inheritance tax, the Walton family was still the richest family in North America. After Sam Walton's death, because Eric took the initiative to step back, Buffett, who succeeded as the richest man at the beginning of this year, only had a personal wealth of $9.3 billion. Even without Frank Wales's words, Eric knew very well that it would be very difficult for him to avoid this position this year and continue to be the invisible richest man. Last year's number on the Forbes list could be explained with reasonable reasons. But this year, not only did Jurassic Park break the global box office record, bring more attention to Firefly Pictures, but the news of Firefly's acquisition of ABC TV network must be disclosed to the public in the near future. The attention to the transaction between the two sides would also make a large number of investment institutions take the initiative to analyze the strength of Firefly Pictures. Under such circumstances, if Forbes released a number similar to last year's, it would definitely attract a lot of doubts. Data that seriously deviated from the facts would be a huge blow to the credibility of a professional financial magazine. Eric knew that the benefits he offered would never allow Steve Forbes to risk the future of the family business. "Well, although I'm not ready yet, I'll take the time to talk to Steve Forbes about this matter." Jeffrey never understood how Eric could avoid this matter. He smiled and said, "Eric, I still think this is a good thing. I really don't understand why you have these messy concerns. Are you afraid that someone will take your money when you wake up?" Eric shrugged helplessly and didn't answer. The other three laughed. "Okay, don't tease me, let's get to the point." Eric and the others laughed for a while, then waved and said. Michael Lynn asked, "Eric, when Buffett left, did he say he would stay in Los Angeles?" Eric shook his head and said, "I didn't ask, but it's going to be Thanksgiving soon. I think Buffett will rush back to Omaha for Thanksgiving, right?" Carson said, "Buffett's wife, Susan, has been living in California for the past few years because Buffett doesn't want his wealth to be divided. Although the two of them are separated, they haven't divorced. I heard that their relationship is still very good. I think Buffett will stay in Los Angeles for Thanksgiving." Eric said, "Even if Buffett stays in Los Angeles, I'll go to New York. And I may not be back before Christmas, so it's up to you to contact Buffett." It was no secret that Eric already had 2 children. Jeffrey even went to Cheongdao to visit the 2 little guys in person. Therefore, it was not surprising that Eric decided to go to New York for Thanksgiving. In addition to Eric, the boss who could slack off, Michael Lynn and the others couldn't be idle at all because of the end of the year. They not only had to follow up on the important film release work at the end of the year, but also audit and summarize the financial and personnel work of Firefly in the past year. These things had actually started in early November, but because of Firefly's growing system, it would be good if everything could be completed before Christmas. Considering these circumstances, Michael Lynn said, "If that's the case, if we can't reach an agreement in private, we have to wait at least until January next year before it's suitable to launch a public acquisition invitation. I suggest pushing the time as far as possible to February or March, so that we can make more early arrangements." It was getting late. Although the 2 young men, Eric and Katzenberg, were still full of energy, Jeffrey and the other 2 were already showing signs of fatigue. Although many details had not been discussed yet, Eric did not intend to let the 3 old men who were already over 50 years old continue to suffer. Finally, he said, "That's it. You can discuss with each other on how to carry out high-profile publicity. If there's anything, you can call or email me," Eric said, standing up and saying, "It's already very late. Why don't you stay here tonight? I'll take you to the guest room. No need. Michael Lynn immediately got up. He didn't want to be a third wheel here. I have a villa near Pepperdine University. It's not far from here. Katzenberg pointed north and said with a smile, "Mine is closer. It's at the foot of the mountain." Frank Wales also smiled and said, "My family originally lived in Malibu." Eric looked at Jeffrey, who quickly waved his hand. "I don't think Michael will refuse to let me stay at his house for a night." "Of course." Michael Lynn nodded with a smile. "I recently bought another batch of good red wine. Jeffrey, Frank, why don't you come and try it?" "Forget it. It's too late today. I'll go when I'm free." Katzenberg shook his head. "I can't either. My wife called me at 11 o'clock to ask why I didn't come home," Frank Wales said, causing the few people present to chuckle and tease him. If not compared to Eric, the four giants of Firefly belonged to the wealthy class. It wasn't surprising that they bought property in a place like Malibu where the rich gathered. Eric didn't urge them to stay. He sent everyone off one by one and returned to the villa. The tables, chairs, and props at the party had been moved away by the party company. The empty hall of the villa was silent. Eric stood in the middle of the hall and looked up at the circular corridor on the second floor. Looking at the tightly shut doors, he inexplicably thought of the famous line in Forrest Gump. He couldn't help but smirk. Life is like a box of chocolates. When Eric woke up, he found himself lying on the floor. Although he didn't have the habit of laying a carpet, the wooden floor didn't make him feel uncomfortable. The air-conditioned bedroom was also very warm, and he didn't feel cold without anything covering him. Unable to feel the existence of his right arm, Eric narrowed his eyes and turned his head. He saw Farmick Johnson lying comfortably on it, sleeping soundly. He had probably been lying there for too long and was completely stiff. Eric looked at the watch he hadn't taken off last night. It was 11:30. He couldn't help but laugh. It had been a long time since he fooled around like this. He carefully reached out his left hand, which could still move, and searched around. He found a pair of pink pajamas, which probably belonged to the girl. Last night, the women had all come in evening gowns. Other than Drew, the others didn't have their own wardrobes in the villa. Eric folded the pajamas with one hand. As they were autumn and winter style, they were very thick. Therefore, he carefully raised his right hand, hoping to place the pajamas under Farmick Johnson's head. Perhaps he had slept enough. Although Eric was very careful, Farmick Johnson quickly woke up. Seeing Eric holding up the pink pajamas with his left hand, the girl smiled and slapped it. "Throw it away. You look so wretched." Eric threw the pajamas to the side, but Farmick Johnson had already leaned over. Recalling what had happened last night, the girl looked up and happened to see a small hand reaching out from the edge of the bed. Although she didn't know whose hand it was, Farmick Johnson didn't hesitate to bite Eric's shoulder. Amidst the man's suppressed cry of pain, the girl couldn't bear to let go and whispered, "Eric, you're getting more and more ridiculous. I'm warning you, don't even think of a next time." Eric smiled and replied, "All right, I promise. Are you hungry? Let's go down and cook." "We won't bring them." Farmick Johnson hugged Eric's waist and whispered, "I want you to cook for me personally." "No problem. You can even eat me. You bastard. I really want to eat you." The two carefully got up. Farmick Johnson walked to the wardrobe and, as usual, looked for Eric's clothes to wear. He noticed that Eric's eyes were occasionally looking at the women on the bed. With a hint of jealousy, he teased, "Why don't I go down alone and you stay behind?" "No, it's just that there seems to be one missing." Farmick Johnson put on a pair of Eric's jeans and looked at the bed. He counted them one by one before saying, "Maybe Nicole has already woken up?" Just as he said that, Nicole's grumbling sounded from the other side of the bed. "It's so uncomfortable. Damn it, who kicked me down?" Chapter 581. When Eric, Farmick, and Nicole finished washing up and went downstairs, the other three women were still asleep. Nicole and Famke were about the same size as Eric. They were wearing Eric's white shirt and jeans. Together with Eric's outfit, the three of them did not look like a couple's outfit, but it was even more so. The Russian twins, who were sitting on the sofa by the curtain wall, saw Eric and the other two appear. They quickly stood up and greeted Eric in unison, "Boss." Over the past few months, Eric had gotten used to the twins' elegant and cold expressions. He also gradually realized that this was just a form of self-protection in an unfamiliar environment. It was not necessarily their nature. Looking at the Sony Walkman and the thick Russian-English dictionary on the coffee table in front of the twins, Eric understood that the two girls were learning English. He waved his hand and said, "You two continue. By the way, have you had lunch?" The twins were wearing identical light blue sweaters and khaki trousers. It was unknown if the older one or the younger one replied, "Yes, boss. Do you need us to help with the meal?" Eric shook his head and motioned for the two girls to continue with their work. He led Nicole and Famke to the kitchen. He still did not know how to tell the twins apart. He had once suggested that the two girls were different colors, but the little girl insisted that the twins were the same thing, claiming that it would be more interesting. Nicole followed Eric until they were out of earshot of the twins. She turned her head to look and tugged at Eric's sleeve. "Are they really boxers?" Eric nodded. "Yes." Famke also said, "I can't tell at all. Their bodies are quite suitable to be models." Eric smiled and said to Famke, "Don't you like boxing occasionally? You can try it with them." Famke felt that Eric's smile was a little mischievous. He was a little wary and asked, "You've tried it?" Eric raised his finger and pointed at the corner of his right eye. "It's been hurting here for many days." The two girls giggled as they imagined Eric's defeated look. Famke even said, "Oh, I remember now. When I came back to see you in August, your eyes were still a little bruised. I thought it was because you weren't in a good mental state at the time and had dark circles under your eyes after insomnia. So it was because you were beaten." Nicole also asked, "Hey, did you eat them?" Eric shook his head with a look of regret. He smiled and said, "I couldn't beat them. With my body, I could only be pushed by them." Nicole raised a small fist and punched Eric's shoulder and said coyly, "You only know how to bully us." "No wonder you didn't bring them to the bedroom last night," Famke Jensen agreed. The three of them walked through the hall to the kitchen on the west side of the first floor of the villa. When they pushed the door open, Famke suddenly remembered and said with a smile, "Right, it seems like we're still missing one person. Where's Penny's sister? How did you forget her last night?" Just as he said that, the three of them saw Monica Cruz standing beside the refrigerator in the kitchen. She was holding a bottle of ketchup in her hands, looking somewhat at a loss. Monica had been in the United States for almost half a year, and daily communication in English was no longer a problem. The girl happened to hear Famke Jensen's last sentence. Seeing the three of them dressed in the same way, she could easily guess what had happened. Last night, she had been sleeping in the same room as her sister. When Eric suddenly barged in, the girl was surprised and somewhat expectant. But in the end, Eric only carried Penelope out of the room and left her alone. Monica thought that Eric didn't like her at all. She felt sad and uneasy the whole night and only managed to fall asleep at dawn. Therefore, she had only woken up a little earlier than Eric and the other two. Just as she was about to go to the kitchen to make something to eat, the three of them walked in. Seeing that the situation was a little awkward, Eric took the initiative to walk forward, took the ketchup from Monica's hand, and put it aside. Seeing that the girl's hair was still a little messy, he asked softly, "Just woke up?" Monica felt that her hands were empty. Suddenly, she didn't know where to put them. She just nodded subconsciously. Yes. Go take a shower first." Eric cupped the girl's face and kissed it gently. He said gently, "I'll personally make lunch for everyone. You can help after you're done." Monica nodded obediently and looked at the two women standing not far away. She asked weakly, "Eric, are you—" "Of course not." Eric didn't wait for the girl to finish and interrupted her. "But this is California. You don't want me to get into trouble, right?" Although Monica was a little confused by Eric's words, she subconsciously shook her head. Eric patted the girl's back. Then go take a shower. Seeing the petite and timid Monica being coaxed out of the kitchen by Eric, Nicole said sourly, "You've never been so gentle with me." Famick Johnson nodded as well. "Not to me either." Eric took out ingredients from the fridge and handed them to the two women. "It can't be that you haven't, right?" Nicole took a bag of bread and glared at Eric. She walked to the kitchen counter and said casually, "Yes, I think there was one time." Eric recalled the time when Nicole cried out in grievance and said guiltily, "There's no need to be jealous of a little girl." Famick put a carton of eggs into the egg cooker one by one. When he heard Eric say that, he teased, "I thought you changed. So you're just afraid of trouble." TSK. I've always been a law-abiding citizen. Eric laughed shamelessly. He couldn't help but complain inwardly. The legal standards of each state in the United States were uneven. Most states could get married at the age of 16. Some states even had the legal age of marriage as low as 12. In some states, 18 was the legal age for sexual activity. If a couple wanted to do something without violating federal law, it was only a matter of space, not time. For a country on wheels, space didn't seem to be a problem. Eric still remembered the rebellious young Mira Jovovich in the original Spacetime. She eloped with her boyfriend at the age of 16 and got married in Las Vegas. In California, her boyfriend, who was 4 years older than her, would have gone to jail for doing so. But in the neighboring state of Nevada, the two could legally get married. It was ironic. Speaking of which, the Resident Evil in this Spacetime might start filming next year. Eric had yet to see Mira Jovovich in the media. It seemed like the Russian actress with a powerful background had been slapped by the butterfly's wings. After a few minutes, Monica still hadn't come back from her shower. Drew, Penelope, and Connolly walked into the kitchen one after another. The little girl covered her mouth and was still yawning. She threw a mobile phone over. "Here, Jeffrey Katzenberg just called. I told him you'd call back later." Eric took the mobile phone and watched as the little girl stretched out her little hand to scoop up the freshly fried sausage. He raised his hand and slapped it away. "Have you brushed your teeth?" "I'm starving," the little girl shouted unwillingly, but she obediently walked out. Eric looked at Connolly and Penelope. Seeing the two girls nod, he pointed to the pan. "Take a look. When it's done, scoop it out." Eric handed the work in his hands to the two girls and walked out with the mobile phone. Although it was noon, after Eric called, Katzenberg still quickly picked up the phone. This workaholic stayed in the office even at noon. Eric, who slept until late in the morning, couldn't help but feel a little embarrassed. According to the content discussed last night, the management of Firefly had already drafted a detailed media public relations plan after a morning of discussion. Katzenberg even found out that Buffett and his wife, Susan, were now living in a vacation villa in Laguna Beach, south of Los Angeles, and had already made an appointment with Buffett. Eric talked to Katzenberg and went to the study on the basement floor. On the other side, Katzenberg began to ask his secretary to fax over the minutes of the morning's meeting. Compared to the brief decision last night, the plan in his hand was much more professional, and it had considered all the possible details. Katzenberg was obviously very excited on the phone. He chatted with Eric for half an hour. During this time, Eric also roughly browsed through the entire plan. Although Katzenberg had already made an appointment with Buffett, the purpose of the media public relations plan in his hand was to show the strength of Firefly Pictures. It could be seen that neither of them had high expectations of a private deal. Fortunately, after the two of them finished talking about this matter, Katzenberg did not continue to talk about anything else. He just told Eric to go to Firefly's headquarters in the afternoon. There were some documents that he needed to sign personally. Then, he hung up the phone. Eric sorted out the fax just now. He turned around and saw Drew sitting quietly on the steps at the entrance, holding a sandwich in her hand and quietly eating it. She smiled and said, "You scared me. Why are you always so silent like a cat? You're the one who gave everyone a fright." The girl stood up with a sandwich in her hand and said, We couldn't find you all of a sudden. We thought you had escaped. Why should I run away? Eric asked with a smile as he followed Druid outside. The girl rolled her eyes and pretended to be confused. I don't understand. Nicole said so. You can ask her. They went to the kitchen together. When they saw Eric appear, the girls sitting quietly around the table seemed to be relieved. The originally strange atmosphere quickly dissolved. Nicole stood up with a smile and pulled out a chair for Eric like a considerate wife. Eric sat down and explained, I talked to Jeffrey for a long time. He's a workaholic. He doesn't even care if others are eating lunch. Why did you think I had escaped? Famick Johnson rolled his eyes at Eric and said to the girls, I knew it. He's such a shameless guy. How could it be? Nicole remembered something she had heard when chatting with Elizabeth and said, How could it not be? This bastard has a criminal record. Eric also realized that Elizabeth had probably said something to Nicole. It was always difficult to understand what women talked about. However, there was a reason why he had escaped back then. Who could resist a girl who could force you to marry her at any time when you woke up? Okay, let's eat, Eric said like the male host. He looked at the girls and teased, Do you want to pray before the meal? Nicole picked up the plate and said, Forget it. God probably won't believe the words coming out of your mouth. There was a burst of laughter in the dining room. Although Eric was gentle and considerate most of the time, his status made the Crew sisters and Connolly dare not casually bicker with Eric. Looking at Nicole and Famick bickering with Eric, they felt a sense of novelty and envy. Eric took a sip of the juice that Nicole had just handed to him. When the girls' laughter died down, he said, It's Thanksgiving soon. Since you're not home, let's have a Thanksgiving dinner together. But I'm going to New York tomorrow. How about tonight? The women looked at each other. No one objected. Eric decided, Tonight then. In the afternoon, you guys go shopping for ingredients. By the way, does anyone know how to roast a turkey? Jennifer Connolly and Drew were the only ones who had the habit of celebrating Thanksgiving. The other women were from other countries. Obviously, they did not know how to roast a turkey. The girl was about to say that they could get the chef to cook, but seeing so many women in the dining room, even if it was the chef from the manor who had signed a confidentiality agreement, seeing such a scene would probably bring a lot of risk. So, she shut her mouth. Eric shook his head helplessly. Then buy 2 more turkeys. We'll discuss how to cook when I come back tonight. If it really doesn't work, we'll order a roasted one from the restaurant. Eric, are you going shopping with us in the afternoon? Penelope asked. Eric shook his head. I need to go to the Firefly headquarters. Before I leave Los Angeles, there are some things that I need to deal with personally. But I should be back soon. Also, be careful when you go out. Don't get caught by the paparazzi. What do you plan to do if we get caught? Nicole asked with a smile. Eric shrugged and smiled. Then I'll have to marry all of you publicly. Famick Jensen said, Then we can only see you in federal prison. Bring me more delicious food when the time comes, Eric said nonchalantly. The women laughed again. In fact, for a tycoon like Eric, the restrictions of federal law were so small that they could be ignored. As long as he didn't do anything out of the ordinary in public and was coincidentally discovered by others, then the possibility of him falling into jail was very small. Even if something happened, he could still escape from jail by paying a huge amount of bail. As for having more women, it was even less of a problem. If a billionaire only lived with one woman, it would be a strange thing in the traditional way of thinking of ordinary people. Chapter 582. After having an early Thanksgiving dinner with the women in Malibu, Eric rushed to New York with his daughter. East Hampton was more suitable as a summer getaway. In winter, there were desolate scenes everywhere. If there was a heavy snowfall, it would be even more deserted. After winter, Virginia and Joanna moved to Southampton with the 2 little guys, which was relatively densely populated and had better infrastructure. The night of Thanksgiving Day was still very lively. Although the 2 women had given the workers and nannies at home a day off, Chris and Emily had rushed over. Together with Eva Pakula, the little girl, and her twin sidekicks, a large group of people filled the dining room. When I was in college, I studied Buffett's deeds. Chris talked about Buffett because they talked about the acquisition of ABC by Firefly that had become a hot topic in the media in recent days. The main reason why Buffett was able to accumulate his wealth through diversified investments is that he is pure enough. He can concentrate on investing to the extreme. Everyone who knows Buffett knows that investing is almost the only pursuit in his life. As a billionaire with a fortune of billions of dollars, he is not willing to spend a penny to improve his life. His personal life is very simple, even his eating habits are simple. The main theme of his life is to read countless financial reports and choose the right company to invest in. This kind of analysis, which is not professional stock trend analysis, can maximize the company's development potential by studying the company's fundamentals. Therefore, Buffett was able to walk on the right path most of the time for decades. Everyone listened to Chris with great interest. The little girl sitting next to Eric, who was eating turkey, suddenly said, "I heard that he destroyed Solomon." Salomon Brothers was known as the king of Wall Street in the 1980s. When Solomon was at its peak, investment banks such as Goldman Sachs, Morgan, and Lehman could only be regarded as Solomon's underlings. However, Solomon was investigated by the SEC in 1990 because of a false bidding case, and then it quickly declined. In less than 4 years, Salomon Brothers had now become a second-rate investment company. At the time of the false bidding case, Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway happened to be the largest shareholder of Salomon Brothers. During the investigation, Buffett personally took over all the management affairs of Salomon Brothers. On the surface, Salomon Brothers did indeed collapse in Buffett's hands. When Chris heard the little girl's words, he shook his head and said with a chuckle, "It's not as simple as you think. This matter is mainly because Salomon Brothers was in the limelight. Take the false bidding case 3 years ago as an example. The Federal Securities Exchange law stipulated that an investment bank could only underwrite 35% of the bonds issued each time. However, Salomon Brothers obtained 85% of the bond distribution through false bidding, and then resold it to other investment banks to earn a huge price difference. Similar things often happen throughout the 1980s. Therefore, after Salomon was investigated by the SEC, it caused the other capital forces to attack it. Of course, Buffett's later handling measures also made a big mistake. As soon as Salomon Brothers passed the SEC's investigation, Buffett couldn't wait to break the rules of Wall Street and greatly reduce the salary and dividends of Salomon Brothers employees. In the end, a large number of employees left. After losing these talents, Salomon Brothers completely lost the capital to make a comeback. I heard that Salomon Brothers has recently become the target of Citibank. It probably won't last for a few years. After Chris finished speaking, the restaurant was silent for a moment. Even the two little guys felt the abnormal atmosphere and stared at their mother with wide eyes. In the end, it was the straightforward Emily who smiled and said, "Eric, it seems that you have to be careful. Fireflies seem to be in the limelight a little too much." Eric sipped his red wine as if nothing had happened and shrugged. "There are large and small investment companies on Wall Street every year, but have you ever seen a big film company being squeezed out by its peers?" Emily retorted straightforwardly, "Leiden, United Artists, and now MGM are all about to collapse, aren't they?" When Chris heard his girlfriend's words, he couldn't help but turn his head. Eric looked at Emily and said with a smile, "Yes, but they all couldn't play in Hollywood because of their own problems." At this time, Chris also said to his girlfriend, "Most of the investment bank's business is virtual financial products, and most of these products come from other companies. They earn profits from stock issuance, bond underwriting, company mergers and acquisitions, but they themselves don't have much output. Once the investment bank is in crisis, the external companies will no longer let it act as an agent for the relevant business under the principle of seeking profits and avoiding losses. Therefore, it often causes a chain domino effect, and it can easily decline. But film companies like Time Warner, Fireflies, and Viacom, which has just acquired Paramount, have formed a complete industrial chain internally. Unless it's a huge investment project that causes a huge loss and causes a bankruptcy crisis, it won't be so easy to be defeated by external forces." "I also saw some news recently," Emily said with some dissatisfaction. 2 years ago, an article in the New York Times analyzed that if Firefly Pictures continues to expand, it is likely to violate the federal anti-monopoly law and be forced to break up. If the company was broken up because of the anti-monopoly law, the company's major shareholders could only choose to keep the shares of one company, and the shares of the other company would have to be sold. It didn't mean that major shareholders like Eric could continue to keep the two companies after the split. Emily's words seemed to hit the nail on the head. Chris also looked worried. He looked at Eric and said, "I think this is indeed a problem that needs to be carefully considered. Eric, before acquiring ABC, you are 100% sure that this won't cause such a problem." Eric had also studied the relevant anti-monopoly law, but he knew the development trend of the American media industry in the next 10 years, so he said very calmly, "Don't worry, there won't be a problem. In fact, I think the integration of media channels is more in line with the interests of the federal government. What do you think?" There was no country that didn't want to control the channels of public opinion, and the so-called strict freedom in any country was relative. Being in Wall Street, where the collision of information was the most intense, Chris was very clear about this truth, so he nodded and smiled. "It seems to be the case." Virginia saw that Eric and Chris were talking in riddles, so she said discontentedly, "Gentlemen, we won't understand if you continue. Why don't we talk about something more relaxing?" Eric nodded. "Well, okay, today's turkey tastes good, compared to, tastes good, not bad." Eric almost blurted out the strange turkey that the women made the night before yesterday. Fortunately, he stopped at the last moment, but Virginia still sensitively heard something and rolled her eyes at Eric. The other people in the restaurant laughed when they saw Eric's uncomfortable look as he held back his words. Although it was only 9 o'clock after dinner, it was already snowing outside the house. It would take 2 hours to get back to Manhattan from the easternmost part of Long Island, and with the slippery roads on a snowy day, it would definitely take longer, and it would be very unsafe. Eric invited Chris and Emily to stay. The villa was very big, and there were enough rooms, so Chris and Emily didn't refuse. After dinner, the women were busy with their own things. Some were watching TV, some were watching the TV in the kitchen, and some were watching the two little guys. Eric and Chris sat next to the old-fashioned fireplace in the villa and talked about the acquisition of Victoria's Secret's parent company, Ltd. During this period, Chris had been secretly buying Ltd's shares. He expected that after the new year, he would be able to officially enter Ltd's board of directors with his shares, and then launch the acquisition offensive. As the largest individual shareholder of Ltd, Leslie Wexner held 35% of the shares, so the success rate of this acquisition was not 100%. Although Chris was full of confidence, he still admitted that he was only 70% sure. Once Leslie Wexner got more than 51% of the shareholders' support, he would have to give up the acquisition. However, it was precisely this uncertainty that made Chris appear to be in high spirits. If everything were to go smoothly, it would seem a little too boring. Moreover, even if the acquisition failed in the end, Ltd would have to pay a certain price to redeem the shares in Firefly's hands. Therefore, this acquisition would not bring any loss to Firefly's investment. The two chatted until late at night, when Eric came to the bedroom. A little guy was lying in the middle of the big bed. Joanna was leaning against Hawaii, holding her head with one hand and reading a book softly. When she saw Eric come in, Joanna put down the book and said, "You can sleep at Vicky's place tonight. Emily and the others are here. We can't let them laugh at us." "Well, let me kiss our little baby first." Eric smiled and lay on the bed. He came to Hawaii and kissed the little guy's pink face. He took the book in Joanna's hand and glanced at it. It turned out to be Andersen's Fairy Tales. Shaking the book, Eric asked with a smile, "Why are you reading this kind of book to our little princess?" Joanna smiled and took the book back from Eric's hand. She said, "What else should we read?" Eric lay next to the little guy and looked at Hawaii's beautiful blue eyes moving back and forth between him and his mother. He smiled and continued, "Anything is fine, but it better not be a fairy tale. It will teach the child bad things. If my daughter learns from the fairy tale and runs away with the coachman when she grows up, I will go crazy. You're always thinking about these messy things." Joanna patted Eric's shoulder and looked at the book in her hand. She furrowed her beautiful eyebrows and said seriously, "Then I'll go to the bookstore tomorrow and see if there's anything suitable to read to Shasha." "Are you serious?" Eric looked up. "It's just a joke. Besides, the little guy may not be able to understand it." Joanna retorted, "Of course she can understand it. Shasha is very smart." Eric remembered Hawaii's reaction when she heard the sound of Joanna reading. He also realized this point and nodded in agreement. He took the Anderson's fairy tales from Joanna's hand and said, "Let me read a paragraph to the baby. Listen to Daddy's voice." Joanna pulled a pillow and put it next to Hawaii. She relaxed her body and lay down on her side. She smiled and said, "Aren't you afraid that she will learn bad things?" "No, if the coachman dares to seduce my daughter, all 5 of his legs will be broken." "Ha ha," Eric said and turned to the Snow Queen. This story was about the friendship between a boy and a girl. Well, the theme was healthy and upbeat. It was very safe. This was it. After Thanksgiving, Los Angeles began to carry out the media publicity plan. It seemed that suddenly, Firefly Pictures, which had been very conservative in terms of information disclosure, began to be high profile. As the CEO of Firefly Pictures, Michael Lynn even personally went on stage for the first time. He went on a financial talk show on the NBC network and talked about the unknown secrets of the development of Firefly Pictures. Variety magazine also gave a high valuation of $25 billion for Firefly Pictures in an article. Eric, who saw this article, was full of criticism. It could have been more or less. Why did it have to be $25 billion? However, he also knew that this was the data submitted by Firefly. Since the article was published, Eric did not edit anything. At the same time, Katzenberg had been in close contact with Buffett. In just a week, the two met 3 times in Los Angeles. However, from each email Katzenberg wrote to Eric, there was no progress in the negotiations. Because of the sudden outburst of media public opinion, Buffett seemed to have entered a wait-and-see stage. Because of the high-profile contact between Eric, Katzenberg, and Buffett, the stock prices of the 3 major television networks, which had been rising together, had different changes. The stock price of ABC began to soar, while the stock price of NBC and CBS fell sharply. Even the stock price of News Corporation, which owned Fox Television Network, was affected. Eric continued to accompany the women and children in Southampton. Occasionally, he would go to Manhattan to attend some parties. The girl who lived with Eric could not stand the cold and boring life in Southampton. The next day, she ran to Manhattan with 2 little followers. Eric knew that the girl had friends all over the world and had her own residence in Manhattan, so he did not ask. Although Thanksgiving was over, the festive atmosphere showed no signs of disappearing. Christmas was not far away. Compared to Thanksgiving, Christmas seemed to be more lively. The only thing that Eric was curious about was how many years the two sides could cooperate with the strength of that irritable old man, Lei Sherdong. Also, without Mission Impossible, the A-series that Paramount couldn't stop watching, Eric was very curious about whether Cruise could make a comeback once he and Paramount fell out again. Of course, this curiosity was quickly forgotten by Eric. While enjoying the warmth of Christmas with the women and children, all kinds of news kept coming from Los Angeles. Warren Buffett stayed in Los Angeles until December 27th. During this period, he had many negotiations with Katzenberg. In the end, the two sides still didn't reach any agreement. Although Buffett made some concessions, the conditions he offered were still unacceptable. On December 27th, Eric specially talked with Buffett in Los Angeles over the phone from East Hampton for 2 hours. Buffett still insisted on exchanging 70% of ABC's shares with Firefly Pictures, but the proportion of shares that Firefly Pictures had to pay was reduced to 40%. According to the current market value of ABC, it was equivalent to exchanging 40% of Firefly Pictures shares for $7 billion. Of course, Eric couldn't accept it. The two sides didn't intend to continue the discussion. Buffett returned to Omaha that day, and Firefly Pictures began to officially prepare for the public acquisition. Just after the New Year's holiday, Chris, who had been preparing for several months, officially asked to join the board of directors of Ltd with his shares in Ltd. He publicly launched an acquisition of Ltd with Brighton Fashion Company as the main body. Although the CEO of Ltd, Leslie Wexney, had realized the abnormality of Ltd's stock price before the new year, Chris had been very careful throughout the process. It wasn't until the news was made public that Leslie Wexney realized the seriousness of the matter. At this time, Chris already owned 12% of Ltd's shares and had unknowingly become the second largest shareholder after Leslie Wexney. Although it was still far from Leslie Wexney's 35% shareholding, Leslie Wexney was very clear that once Chris successfully entered the board of directors of Ltd and drew other shareholders to his side, then Leslie Wexney was likely to lose control of Ltd. Therefore, Leslie Wexney quickly launched the poison pill plan, publicly claiming that once Chris's shareholding exceeded 15%, Ltd would issue additional shares to major shareholders at a price far lower than the public share price to dilute Chris's shares. Chris, who had long been prepared, immediately counterattacked. Brighton Fashion Company's lawyer representative said at the press conference that Leslie Wexney's behavior had damaged most of the shareholders' right to freely decide whether to sell the company's shares or not. Moreover, it was a barbaric plunder of other Ltd shareholders who could not accept the additional shares at a low price. Therefore, federal regulators were requested to stop the behavior of Ltd's management. While Leslie Wexney lambasted Brighton Fashion Company and Firefly Investment for a hostile takeover, in order to show the legitimacy of his behavior to the public, he decided to hold an interim shareholders meeting at Ltd's headquarters on January 20 to allow shareholders to freely vote on whether to launch the poison pill plan. However, later, Brighton Fashion Company and Firefly Investment published the company's detailed development plan after the acquisition of Ltd in the famous financial magazine, Business Weekly, stating that their acquisition behavior was a normal business acquisition, not a hostile takeover. At the same time, Chris submitted a series of documents prepared in advance to the SEC. Before the Ltd's interim shareholders meeting was held, the SEC announced that Ltd's poison pill plan would be ruled invalid even if it passed the vote of the interim shareholders meeting. Subsequently, Chris, as the joint representative of Brighton Fashion Company and Firefly Investment, proposed an acquisition price of $19 per share to Ltd for the first time. While announcing Brighton Fashion Company's annual financial report last year, he also announced a series of financing plans for the acquisition. On the other hand, Leslie Wexney simply quoted a high price of $35 per share, which was more than twice the price of Ltd's share price. When this offer came out, Leslie Wexney was immediately evaluated by a business magazine as losing his mind. For a time, the acquirer and the acquirer went back and forth, and the show continued. Although this business was not too big in the recent 2 years of mergers and acquisitions, since the king of junk bonds, Michael Milken, went to prison and the corporate sniper, Ron Perlman, kept a low profile, this was the first large-scale leveraged buyout case on Wall Street recently. Because it was not clear how much bargaining chips Firefly Investment and Brighton Fashion Company had in private, some people even compared it to the acquisition of Revlon. A few years ago, Ron Perlman bought Revlon, which had a market value of $1 billion, with a capital of $150 million. In order to cooperate with Firefly Pictures' plan, Eric chose to attend the Golden Globe Awards ceremony this year, so he returned to Los Angeles in mid-January. However, like many people, Eric also paid attention to the series of exchanges between Chris and Leslie Wexney. Although he was a layman, Eric also clearly realized that Leslie Wexney was at a disadvantage. However, Firefly Pictures was also nervously preparing for the public acquisition of ABC, so Eric did not have much time to think about these things. After the end of the New Year holiday, Firefly Pictures immediately released the company's 1994 movie list. In addition to major films such as Saving Private Ryan, The Lion King, and True Lies, there were also some reboots of classic horror films under the New Line Cinema. At the same time, Firefly Pictures' TV drama department officially announced that after the 5th season of Friends, Firefly Pictures would terminate the contract with Fox Television Network. While continuing to produce Friends, Firefly Pictures' TV drama department would develop several other TV dramas and reality shows to expand their network business. Although this layer of window paper was not publicly broken, At this time, everyone in North America who paid attention to the news knew that it was only a matter of time before Firefly Pictures launched a public acquisition of ABC. After Firefly Pictures released the 1994 film list, in early February, as soon as the latest issue of Variety magazine was published, it immediately ran out of stock. The magazine had to urgently print 100,000 copies of the magazine to deal with the emergency. The reason why this film magazine, which had always been of interest to Hollywood professionals, suddenly ran out of stock was because Firefly Pictures published Firefly Pictures' 1993 annual financial report in Variety for the first time. Throughout 1993, Firefly Pictures released a total of 28 films, an average of more than 2 films per month. On the other hand, Firefly Pictures had once again captured 29% of the box office share due to Jurassic Park's amazing box office earnings of US $447 million in North America this year, as well as Clash of Heaven and Earth, The Bugs Crisis, and other films that were still screening at the end of the year such as Detective 2, Pulp Fiction, and Interview with the Vampire at Night, which were still showing at the end of the year. Firefly Pictures had once again captured 29% of the box office share. The North American box office for the entire year was expected to reach US $1.74 billion. Due to the stimulation of the blockbuster event movie Jurassic Park, the box office for the entire 1993 North American year exceeded US $6 billion for the first time. Due to the strong locomotive effect caused by the success of Jurassic Park and other films, Firefly Pictures' 1993 net profit hit a new high, reaching $1.19 billion, a total increase of $200 million from last year. Compared to last year, Firefly Pictures' net profit was only $30 million more than Time Warner's. Last year, due to the huge impact caused by the death of Steve Ross, who had been in charge of Time Warner for decades, Time Warner's net profit did not increase but instead decreased to only $870 million. Firefly Pictures' profit exceeded Time Warner's by $320 million. Behind Time Warner, Universal, Paramount, Fox, Columbia, and Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer's total profit was less than $2 billion. This was because Under the Torment of Peter Guber, although Broken Arrow, which was a collaboration with Firefly at the end of the year, did well at the box office, Columbia's other films rarely turned a profit. Overall, Sony and Columbia were still losing money. Although Metro-Goldwyn-Mayer regained some vitality under the leadership of John Carey and others, it was still not as prosperous as some of the second- and third-tier film companies. The total number of films produced and distributed by MGM in 1993 was less than a fraction of Firefly Pictures. While the entire capital market was studying Firefly Pictures' 1993 annual financial report, Firefly Pictures officially submitted an acquisition application to ABC's board of directors in early February. Compared to the confrontation caused by Chris's acquisition of LTD, ABC's reaction was much milder. It seemed that in response to Firefly Pictures' 1993 annual financial report, ABC also announced the network's 1993 profits in advance. Although it was not as huge as Firefly Pictures' total profit of $19 billion, ABC also achieved a net profit of $520 million in 1993, ranking first among the 4 major television networks in North America, with a market share of 23%. Although there were only 4 national public television networks in North America, since the advent of premium cable television in the 1980s, a large number of premium cable programs entered the primetime viewing competition, and the market share of the major television networks kept declining. ABC was able to achieve a market share of 23%, which was much more than NBC, CBS, and Fox. After Firefly Pictures publicly issued an acquisition offer, ABC also quickly responded. Tom Murphy, the chairman of the board of directors and CEO of ABC, personally called Eric and said that if Eric intended to acquire ABC with cash and stock, then Firefly Pictures would first have to bear 35% capital gains tax arising from the cash transaction on the basis of ABC's stock price at this time. That was to say, Firefly Pictures' cash acquisition must not be less than 1.35 times ABC's stock price at this time. After a period of continuous rise in stock price, ABC's stock price had reached a new high. Its market value had reached an astonishing $11.2 billion, which was nearly $2 billion higher than in the middle of last year. However, Eric also knew that this was inevitable, so he agreed on the spot. Right now, the most important thing was of course to complete the acquisition of ABC as soon as possible. If this acquisition became a long-term tug of war, then Eric would rather give up on ABC and change his target. Chapter 584. Although Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway and Tom Murphy's Metropolis Media did not have an absolute controlling stake in ABC television network, the nearly 40% shares of the two companies meant that after Buffett negotiated with Firefly in private, it would be easy to persuade the board to agree to the deal. However, ABC television network was definitely not monolithic. Although Buffett's attitude was tough, it did not mean that the other major shareholders of ABC television network did not want to reach a deal with Firefly, especially since Firefly Pictures had achieved huge profits for many years since its establishment. Even at the end of last year, when Buffett contacted Firefly alone, some shareholders publicly expressed dissatisfaction with Buffett's behavior of concealing the negotiation information. After Firefly Pictures released its 1993 annual financial report, many investment institutions that held shares in ABC television network became even more eager to facilitate this transaction. After all, some benefits were very easy to calculate. With the profitability of Firefly Pictures, after the merger, even if the original shareholders of ABC television network only held 30% of the equity in the integrated company, as long as Firefly's profitability did not change too much, the annual profits and dividends received by the shareholders were almost the same as when they were in ABC. Furthermore, they could extract a large amount of funds from this cash and equity transaction to use for other investments. After Firefly Pictures and Buffett's negotiation failed and publicly announced the acquisition invitation, the board of directors of ABC television network quickly passed a resolution and agreed to start negotiations with Firefly Pictures. On February 10, after receiving an official reply from ABC television network, Katzenberg and Firefly Pictures chief lawyer, Edward Lewis, led the acquisition team to New York and began formal acquisition negotiations with ABC. Because the equity and debt situation of ABC television network was not as simple and straightforward as that of Firefly Pictures, Firefly also invited Morgan Stanley's team as a consultant under Chris's lead. In the process of acquiring Disney, the two sides had a very pleasant cooperation. Firefly Pictures was no longer what it used to be, and its own rich administrative resources made it so that Firefly did not have to fully rely on Morgan Stanley's team in this acquisition. However, Morgan Stanley was still very enthusiastic. The whole Wall Street could see that Morgan Stanley was deliberately showing goodwill to Firefly Pictures. After the negotiation, Firefly would definitely launch a large-scale debt financing plan in order to complete the acquisition, and the agency issuance of stocks and bonds was the main business of investment banks. The profits obtained from this were much higher than the corporate mergers and acquisitions that they occasionally handled. Eric didn't go to New York with Katzenberg. Instead, he communicated with Katzenberg over the phone every day. Of course, before Katzenberg left New York, the senior management of Firefly had already discussed the bottom line of the acquisition of Firefly Pictures in detail. After many discussions, Eric authorized Katzenberg to sell up to 25% of Firefly's shares. As for cash, it was relaxed to within $10 billion. Firefly Pictures and ABC Television were both in a period of very good performance. Therefore, no one doubted that the merger of the two sides would produce an effect of 1 + 1 greater than 2. Under the best performance expectations, once the two sides merged, the profits of Firefly in the next few years were likely to reach $2 billion. In this case, the percentage of income of shareholders with 25% equity would be equivalent to the annual income of ABC television network at this time, so this data was still relatively easy for ABC to accept. Of course, what would happen in the future, no one could predict except for Eric, who could see the future. Perhaps after the merger, Firefly's revenue and profits would explode again, or perhaps under the heavy debt burden of $10 billion after the acquisition, Firefly would be destroyed. Eric was always very optimistic about this deal. Although Disney's performance fell into a downturn for many years after the acquisition of ABC in the original spacetime, it was more due to Michael Eisner's personal reasons. After Michael Eisner stepped down, the Disney Group quickly regained its vitality. Whether in scale or profitability, it was far ahead of the giants such as Time Warner and News Corporation. All this was enough to prove the correctness of this acquisition. As for the huge debt burden after the acquisition, Eric did not care about it. The late 1990s would be the period of the most rapid economic development in the United States. All economic sectors, including the entertainment industry, would grow significantly. In addition, Eric's layout in the high-tech industry, even if Firefly was really in a difficult situation for a while, Eric could easily raise enough funds from other channels to resolve Firefly's crisis. What's more, the possibility of this kind of thing happening was not high. Since last year, Eric had repeatedly requested to expand the 3D animation department of Firefly Pictures. However, in this era, 3D animation technology was just emerging. Except for Pixar, there was no large-scale 3D animation company in North America or even the world. As a last resort, Eric could only adopt an internal training mechanism. While expanding the scale of Pixar, Disney's hand-drawn animation department also stopped the recruitment and training of hand-drawn animators and gradually tried to convert to computer animation. While maintaining close contact with Katzenberg in New York, Eric's main energy recently was focused on his animation department. For this reason, he personally led the exchange meeting between Pixar and Disney animation departments. Disney's animation department had already completed the production of The Lion King, and they had already begun the early stages of publicity. Other than The Lion King, Disney Animation also had several animation sequels, including Aladdin and the Magic Lamp 2. Because the production cycle of hand-drawn animation was longer than 3D animation, these projects had been confirmed before Firefly Pictures acquired Disney. However, in addition to these, Eric no longer approved new hand-drawn animation film projects. He did not hesitate to say that if Disney's existing hand-drawn animators were not willing to accept computer animation training, after the hand-drawn animation film projects in their hands were completed, these people could only produce low-cost animation projects for Disney's Children's Channel in the future. Most of Disney's hand-drawn animators were not too old. Coupled with their very skilled drawing skills, it was not too difficult to complete the training of computer animation production software. In order to avoid the backlash of hundreds of hand-drawn animators, Eric also promised to give these people ample time to learn and adapt, and fully bear the cost of the training period. The Pixar staff who participated in the exchange meeting came out of Disney's animation studio headquarters in Burbank one after another. John Lasseter, who walked side by side with Eric, said, "Eric, although no one publicly refuted just now, I feel that many people in the studio are still very resistant to this change. Maybe you will encounter a little trouble." Of course, Eric knew this very well. Disney Animation Studio had more than 700 hand-drawn animators. Although more than 70% of them were around 30 years old, some of them were even old people from Walt Disney's era. These people would definitely not be able to adapt to the new way of animation production, so it was almost inevitable that they would be eliminated in the future. Under such circumstances, no one would just sit back and do nothing. The reason why no one came out to refute Eric's statement was mainly because Pixar's 3D animation was almost overwhelming. Moreover, Eric's announcement was a little too sudden, and many people did not have time to react. Therefore, no one would be unprepared to be the first bird in a situation like this. They all understand the advantages of 3D animation over hand-drawn animation. Whether it is Toy Story or The Bug, they have all proven this, so this change is inevitable. Eric and John Lasseter walked and said, "If they can't complete this change, Firefly will have to lay them off. And I have done what I can do." The current hand-drawn animation project in their hands can last for at least 2 years. Time is very easy for them. If they are really laid off, I think they will never be desperate. Major TV stations need a lot of hand-drawn animators to make children's cartoons. John Lasseter, who had worked in Disney for a long time, heard Eric's words and sighed slightly in his heart. But he knew very well that capital was ruthless. Although Eric was not a harsh boss, he was not a philanthropist either. It was very difficult for him to do this. If it were other companies, if they were not optimistic about the prospects of hand-drawn animation, they might directly announce layoffs instead of giving the employees such a relaxed time to adapt. It was still early. Because of their busy work, John Lasseter and others did not plan to spend the night in Los Angeles. Eric also specially arranged for a commercial plane under Firefly Pictures to send them back to San Francisco. Eric planned to personally send John Lasseter and others to Santa Monica Airport, but just when he arrived at the parking lot, he saw Elizabeth, wearing a pair of aviator glasses, getting out of a red BMW car. She waved at Eric and walked over. "Eric, I think we have to go to Santa Monica ourselves," John Lasseter said to Eric with a smile when he saw Elizabeth's slender figure. The others also chuckled. Eric waited for Elizabeth to come over and took the initiative to introduce the two sides. Looking at the girl's hesitant look, Eric had to give up the idea of sending John Lasseter and others. Fortunately, John Lasseter and others did not care too much about these details. After saying goodbye to Eric, they all got in the car and left. After everyone left, Eric and Elizabeth walked to the red BMW together. He reached out and knocked on the hood with a smile and asked, "New car?" Elizabeth put on her aviator glasses again, raised her chin and teased, "I bought it half a year ago." In the eyes of a guy like you who never cares about others, it's not wrong to say that it's new. Eric looked around and saw that there was no one around. He reached out and pinched Elizabeth's chin. He smiled and said, "Don't you think that if you have something to ask me, you should put away your little claws?" Elizabeth slapped Eric's hand away and said with a righteous look, "We have completed the acquisition of Mira Mike." It was almost time to get off work. Eric did not want to be surrounded by people. He opened the door and sat in the red BMW. Smelling the faint feminine fragrance in the car, he asked Elizabeth, who followed in, "Oh, how much did it cost?" Elizabeth started the car and slowly drove out of the parking lot. She said, $100 million to buy 90% of Mira Mike's shares. The Wayne Stan brothers will keep 10% of the shares and continue to be in charge of Mira Mike's business. It's a bit expensive, but it's a good choice to let the Wayne Stan brothers keep some shares. Otherwise, if the two of them leave, Mira Mike won't have much value. Elizabeth said, "If the two of them leave Mira Mike, they won't have much value either." And with the whole News Corporation as their backing, the two mercenary brothers won't leave so easily. Eric said, "The Wayne Stan brothers suffered enough from the lack of funds and channels in the past few years. In the first few years, of course, they worked very happily with 20th Century Fox. But people are ambitious. When you can't tolerate the brothers' ambition, everyone will go their separate ways." Elizabeth personally participated in the negotiation of the acquisition of Mira Mike, so of course she knew very well what kind of people the brothers were. If that's the case, they can leave if they want. Fox can't let them take over. Eric watched Elizabeth turn the steering wheel and turn onto the highway. Then he remembered and asked, "Where are you taking me?" Elizabeth said in a fearless tone, "The company's top management has decided to let the Wayne Stan brothers be the producers of Braveheart. This project is the first that you have your eyes on, so let's have dinner together and talk about it." Eric was shocked by Elizabeth's matter-of-fact tone. He asked weakly, "Well, Firefly and Fox are competitors after all. Is this helping the enemy?" "Yes." Elizabeth nodded vigorously. "If you don't want to, that woman called Sophie Marceau can go back to wherever she came from." "Okay, you win." Humph. The meeting place was an exquisite French restaurant in Beverly Hills. Seeing Eric arrive, the Wayne Stan brothers were very enthusiastic, but Mel Gibson was much colder. Eric could feel that this guy had either lost his nature due to success, or his EQ was too low. On the other hand, Mel Gibson's agent, Ed Limato, was very enthusiastic. Eric remembered this person. It seemed that Ed Limato had been Mel Gibson's agent since the early 1980s until his death. He had been Mel Gibson's agent for more than 20 years. Ed Limato was 20 years older than Mel Gibson, and the relationship between the two was like that of a father and son. However, he couldn't remember the exact date of Ed Limato's death. If Ed Limato's death happened to coincide with the decline of Mel Gibson's career, then Mel Gibson's and Tom Cruise's experiences were too similar. At the same time, it once again proved how important a good agent was. Chapter 585. The so-called butterfly effect was actually an example of chaos theory. Another classic example was the story of a horseshoe nail destroying a country. A more popular explanation of chaos theory was that everything was made up of countless fragments. Any change in one of the fragments could have a great impact on the whole. From the beginning of an idea to the final completion of a movie, it would need to go through countless fragments. Perhaps a screenwriter would occasionally come up with a brand new idea, or perhaps an editor would accidentally cut a certain scene incorrectly. Therefore, in the case where history had already deviated, it was almost impossible to make a movie exactly the same as the original time and space. Although the creative core of Braveheart was Mel Gibson, the film's excellent shots and soundtrack had a lot to do with the cinematographer and soundtrack. If the new cinematography and soundtrack were too different from the original style, the whole movie might look completely different from the original. Eric did not talk too much about the details of the script with the Wayne-Stan brothers and Mel Gibson. Instead, he focused on the details that would affect the style of the whole movie. There were many eccentric stars in Hollywood, but no one would be stupid enough to throw a tantrum in front of a Hollywood big boss, even if the Hollywood big boss was 10 years younger than him. Coupled with Ed Limato and Wayne-Stan, the meal was quite enjoyable. Although Mel Gibson was already an A-list star in Hollywood, it was still impossible for him to compete with the people at the top of the pyramid. Eric heard that a few years ago, when Mel Gibson worked with Universal on Frightened Birds, he concealed the overseas box office earnings during the film's release. During the process of his first film, The Faceless Man, the whole crew was directly kicked out of the Universal set, which caused a stir in the tabloids. Mel Gibson must have recognized his position in that incident. Walking out of the restaurant, Eric and Elizabeth said goodbye to Wayne-Stan and the others and got into Elizabeth's red BMW. As Elizabeth drove, she casually asked Eric, who was sitting in the passenger seat, "You don't seem to like Mel Gibson?" Eric replied indifferently, "It doesn't matter if I like it or not. His movies are pretty good, but his character is a little bad. Furthermore, you know that although celebrities rarely come in contact with film studios, and most of them are handled by their agents, it's still rare for celebrities to have close contact with the higher-ups of film studios. This is because everyone's standpoints are different, especially when it comes to salary." Elizabeth smiled and said, "That's why everyone is envious of fireflies." Eric asked in confusion, "What?" Elizabeth explained, "The protagonists in the animated films produced by Firefly are the most worry-free stars in Hollywood. They won't talk about pay with the boss, they won't throw tantrums, and they won't go on strike. They'll work hard without complaint and even give you the right to use their image for free to earn more money." Eric smiled and realized something. He asked, "Fox also wants to make animated films?" "Yes, but we're not as willing to spend money as you are. Although my father has firm control of News Corporation, he still has to answer to the shareholders. If we spend too much money on early research and development but can't produce results, it will definitely be troublesome. My father is very envious of you. Firefly is an unlisted company, so we don't have to accept all kinds of information disclosure every year, and we don't have to work hard to explain the strategic intentions of a business action to the shareholders. Sigh, last year, News Corporation's accounting expenses from various audits exceeded $12 million. That's enough money to make a good movie." Eric ignored the girl's complaints and asked, "Then what are you going to do?" "Fox plans to test the waters of 2D animation. It's simpler and doesn't require much investment. Also, it's easier to find staff who can draw animations." Eric almost blurted out that he could provide them with talent. However, if it were any other company, Eric might have done so without hesitation. However, he could not do something that would harm his own woman. "Don't do 2D animation. Let me tell you, I've already decided to close down Disney's hand-drawn animation department. You can either not do it, or go straight to 3D animation." Elizabeth's eyes widened and she asked in surprise, "What, you're going to close down Disney Animation Studio?" Eric shook his head and said, "Of course not, I'm just going to stop the production of 2D animation. Disney Animation Studio will fully undergo digital transformation." Elizabeth pondered for a moment and roughly understood Eric's intention. She blinked enviously and said, "It's easier for you to transform into 3D animation. You just have to transfer the accumulated technology of Pixar to Disney Animation Studio. We have to start from scratch." Eric looked at the girl who was pretending to be pitiful and smiled. It's no use blinking. I don't even have enough people on my side. Firefly plans to expand the animation department to the scale of 1 or 2 movies a year, but now Pixar can only produce 1 movie every 2 years. Of course I don't want people on your side. Elizabeth blinked again. Just license Pixar's exclusive 3D animation production software to Fox. You can name the price. Eric still shook his head. Unless you sell me 51% of the shares of your animation studio. Ask your father if he's willing to do that. No, Elizabeth immediately answered for Murdoch. Then, she stopped looking at Eric and focused on driving. She already knew that there was not much hope in this matter, or rather, there was no hope at all. The reason why Firefly was able to monopolize the huge profits of 3D animation in recent years was because of Pixar's absolute technological advantage. Although Firefly Software began to publicly release the Maya software for special effects production in the digital domain after the establishment of Firefly Software, the digital domain even publicly stated that the publicly released Maya was a watered-down version. The core technology was still tightly held in the hands of the digital domain. Therefore, if Eric really agreed to this matter, Elizabeth would feel that there was something wrong with it. The two of them drove slowly up the Beverly Hills in the middle of the night. Eric inadvertently glanced at the roadside and asked, "Trussdale Manor should be east, right?" Elizabeth was about to speak when Eric remembered that they were in this car. He quickly said, I know. We've moved to a new place." Elizabeth snorted softly and said, "We're now living on Crest Street at the top of the mountain." Eric did not know where Crest Street was. He preferred the Trussdale Manor, where Hollywood stars gathered. It was the area with the best view of Hollywood. Sitting by the pool on the villa's terrace gave people a sense of superiority. "I still think the Trussdale Manor is not bad," Elizabeth said in a resentful tone. "Anyway, I don't want to be neighbors with that crazy girl Drew anymore. I thought you two had reconciled." "It's not a big deal. Didn't we already figure it out?" "Humph," Elizabeth snorted and turned her head away, ignoring Eric. Although the mansions in Beverly Hills were more luxurious than the previous, the infrastructure between the mountain roads was really poor. There were old telephone poles, streetlights that only appeared in the distance, and bare hillsides. The car went all the way up the mountain road. Eric was even worried that something would roll down the slope with poor soil and water conservation. Finally, they reached the top of the mountain. The red BMW drove into a manor. Eric stood in front of the courtyard and looked around. He was very surprised. Not only could this place overlook the entire Los Angeles, but it could even see the valley area in the north. The view was definitely more open than the Trussdale Manor. Elizabeth looked at Eric's reaction with a little pride and said, "This mansion occupies an entire mountain. It's no worse than the Trussdale Manor, right?" "Of course." Eric nodded with satisfaction. He looked at the mountain road on the other side of the hill that led to Burbank. It seemed that it could lead to the Firefly headquarters in Burbank. This road was definitely much closer than the one Eric had been walking in the past few days. He said, "It just so happens that I've been too busy recently to go back to Malibu. I'll stay here." Elizabeth blushed and said, "Don't you intend to ask for my opinion first?" Eric laughed and said, "I've already agreed. What's there to ask?" Elizabeth tiptoed and lightly kicked Eric's leg. She said reluctantly, "Let's go in. Do you want coffee?" It was only 10 o'clock, and Eric was not very sleepy. He nodded and said, "Okay." The two of them pushed open the door of the villa and walked into the living room. There was only a dim yellow wall lamp in the living room. Before Elizabeth turned on the fluorescent lights in the living room, the two of them noticed an obvious white light coming from the kitchen. "Maybe Julia forgot to close the refrigerator door," Elizabeth said casually. Eric narrowed his eyes warily and pointed. Elizabeth looked over and saw a white shadow staying near the refrigerator. "We don't have a pet at home. What is it?" Elizabeth, on the other hand, was not worried. She turned on the fluorescent lights and the two of them walked to the kitchen together. Then, they saw a small figure sitting on the floor, holding a chocolate cake and eating it with relish. Around the little figure were bottles and jars that had fallen out of the fridge. Elizabeth quickly walked over and snatched the chocolate cake from the little girl's hand. She asked, "Emma, why are you here?" Emma whimpered in dissatisfaction when Elizabeth snatched the cake from her hand. Eric also saw that the little girl's face and body were covered in cream, like a dirty kitten. He said, somewhat annoyed and amused, "Don't you have a nanny at home?" When Emma heard Eric's figure, she turned her little head and looked over. She stared blankly at Eric for 2 seconds, and immediately reached out her 2 little hands to Eric happily. "Dad, Dad." Elizabeth helplessly glared at Eric, but did not try to correct the way Emma called him. She handed the little girl over and said, "You hold her first. I'll go see if Carly is here. How did this happen?" Eric thought that the Carly that Elizabeth mentioned should be Emma's nanny. He did not mind at all and took the dirty little girl from Elizabeth's hands. The 2 of them walked out of the kitchen together. Seeing Elizabeth turn and walk into a corridor, Eric sat down on the sofa in the living room with the little girl in his arms and asked softly, "Emma, why are you in the kitchen alone?" Emma, who was already 3 years old, had no problem communicating. When she heard Eric's words, the little girl pitifully hugged her stomach. "Emma, hungry, Auntie, won't give food." Eric immediately frowned. It can't be that serious, right? She's a biological aunt, not a stepmother. Elizabeth soon led a plump Caucasian woman in blue pajamas into the living room. She pointed at Emma and the mess in the kitchen angrily. "How are you taking care of the child? It's a good thing she ate cake. What if she choked on something else?" The nanny named Carly looked aggrieved. "Miss Murdoch, this is not my fault. Miss Robert came back tonight and said that she would take care of Emma herself. She also said that she would coax Emma to sleep tonight." Eric took out a tissue from the paper box on the table and helped the little girl clean the cream on her face. He asked, "Has Emma eaten dinner?" The nanny, of course, knew who Eric was. She shook her head cautiously. "Well, Mr. Williams, I don't know. After Miss Roberts said that she would take care of Emma herself, I went back to my room to rest." Eric smiled and shook his head. It seemed that the problem was with Julia. He waved his hand and said, "You go rest first." The nanny pointed at the mess and asked, "Do you want me to clean up the kitchen?" "No need, we'll talk about it tomorrow." Eric shook his head. After the nanny left, Eric handed Emma, who was wrapped around him, to Elizabeth. "You go and give the little girl a bath first. I'll go and see what happened to Julia. Which room is she in?" Elizabeth also understood the crux of the matter at this time. She was a little helpless about Julia's carelessness. She pointed to the stairs and said, "The first room upstairs." Eric took out a few pieces of tissue and wiped the cream on his chest from Emma. He walked towards the stairs. Elizabeth looked at Eric's back and shrugged slightly before taking the little girl to the bathroom. Eric went upstairs and opened the door of a bedroom. He turned on the light and saw Julia lying on the big bed without a care for her image. Only a thin blanket covered her body, and the air was filled with a faint smell of alcohol. You're tuning in to the Narrate and Escape YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.